The sound of my family's 187-year-old padlock being destroyed at 6:42 in the morning should have broken my heart. Instead, it was the sweetest symphony I'd heard since the day my daughter was born. Because on the other side of those forged doors, Sheriff Elena Rodriguez was waiting with handcuffs, a body camera, and 8 months of meticulously documented federal crimes, ready to send these bastards to prison. Steam fogged the kitchen window where I stood, coffee forgotten in my grip. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation of justice finally arriving. 3 men in Property Enforcement Solutions polo shirts moved through the pre-dawn fog like shadows, their bolt cutters screeching through the chain I deliberately left weak enough to cut. The morning air carried the smell of dew on ancient oak beams, mixing with the sharp metallic bite of cut metal and the approaching scent of constitutional reckoning. What they couldn't see through those barn doors was Sheriff Rodriguez crouched behind a hand-hewn beam that had witnessed the Underground Railroad, the Civil War, 2 world wars, and was about to witness 3 felons walk face first into federal law enforcement. Her radio was live. Her handcuffs were ready. Every syllable they spoke would be recorded with FBI-grade equipment. Every movement captured in high definition. Every crime documented with the kind of precision that makes prosecutors smile in their sleep. 30 seconds later, the sound echoing from that historic forge wasn't hammering or sawing. It was pure, undiluted panic. 3 grown men realizing they'd just committed breaking and entering in front of a county sheriff who'd been documenting their every move. The scrambling sounds of boots on old floorboards, the confusion in their voices, the beautiful music of criminal stupidity meeting constitutional reality. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because 8 months earlier, I didn't feel like a tactician setting traps for federal criminals. I felt like a 61-year-old widower standing at his grandfather's funeral, wondering if I had enough strength left to face another loss. The March wind cut through Grayson County Cemetery with the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. Samuel Ironwood lay in a simple pine casket he'd built himself 20 years ago, when he still believed he'd live forever. 94 years old, Korean War veteran, master blacksmith, and the last link to a history that stretched back before the Civil War. My grandfather, my teacher. The man who taught me that some things in this world are worth more than money or comfort or peace. 47 people attended the funeral, small, intimate, the way Samuel would have wanted it. My daughter Jennifer stood beside me in her black dress, holding her son Tyler's hand. 8 years old, the boy stared at the casket with the kind of confusion only children have when confronting death for the first time. Jennifer's husband David stood slightly apart, checking his phone even here, even now. Some men never learn what matters. I delivered the eulogy, though the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. How do you summarize a life that spanned nearly a century? How do you explain to strangers that the man in that box was the only person who understood the shape of my grief when my wife Diane died 3 years ago? I stood at the podium, my dress uniform feeling tight across shoulders that hadn't carried this kind of weight in years. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 32 years as an automotive engineer, 61 years of living, and I'd never felt as lost as I did staring at those 47 faces, trying to find words that wouldn't shatter the fragile control I'd maintained since finding Samuel collapsed in the forge, hammer still in his hand, mid-swing on a project he'd never finish. The words came eventually, halting, inadequate, but honest. I told them about Samuel teaching me to forge my first horseshoe when I was 12. The smell of coal fire, the sound of hammer on anvil, the feeling of his calloused hands guiding mine. I told them about the day I came home from Afghanistan, how Samuel didn't ask questions or demand explanations. He just handed me a hammer and said work helps when words don't. What I didn't tell them was how many nights I'd spent in that forge after Diane died, beating metal until my arms went numb, trying to forge away the cancer that had stolen her. How Samuel would sit in the corner, not speaking, just being present. How he understood that some grief is too big for conversation. The reading of the will happened 3 days later in a lawyer's office that smelled of old leather and expensive wood polish. Samuel had been thorough, as always, small bequests to the veterans of foreign wars, to the Historical Society, to the church he'd attended for 70 years. And to me, everything that mattered: the forge, the workshop, 4.2 acres of land that had been in the Ironwood family since 1837. Jennifer drove me home afterward, Tyler chattering in the back seat about something from school. She pulled into my driveway, put the car in park, and turned to face me with the expression she'd inherited from her mother. The look that said, "I need to talk to you, and you're not going to like it." "Dad," she said, and I could hear the next words before she spoke them. "You need to think about selling the property." I stared through the windshield at the farmhouse Samuel had helped his father build in the 1890s. At the forge rising behind it, solid and square and permanent, at the old-growth oaks that had shaded 4 generations of Ironwood men. "The property's worth at least $600,000, Jennifer continued. "Maybe more. You could move closer to us in Nashville. One of those nice retirement communities with activities and healthcare and—" "And what?" I interrupted. "Wait to die in a place that looks like every other place? Surrounded by strangers who don't know my name?" She flinched, and I immediately regretted the harshness. Jennifer meant well. She always meant well. But she'd grown up in suburbs and strip malls. She'd never understood what it meant to have roots that went deeper than a mortgage. "Dad," she said softly, "I'm worried about you. You're alone out here. What if something happens?" "Then something happens," I said. "Jen, I appreciate the concern. I do. But this land, this forge, it's the past," she finished. "Mom's gone. Grandpa Samuel's gone. You're alive. You need to act like it." The words hit harder than any punch I'd taken in 61 years. Because she was right. In her way, I was alive, technically, biologically. But most days I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, going through motions that had lost their meaning. Tyler saved us both from saying things we'd regret. He climbed out of the back seat and pressed his face against my window. "Grandpa, can I see the forge, please?" Jennifer started to object, but I was already opening the door. The boy needed something other than adult sadness, and I needed a reason to walk away from this conversation before it broke something between us that couldn't be repaired. The forge stood where it had stood for 187 years. Massive oak beams, hand-hewn and mortised with the kind of precision modern construction has forgotten. The roof Samuel had replaced 10 years ago. Cedar shakes that would outlast us all. The walls that had sheltered people fleeing slavery, that had equipped soldiers heading to war, that had witnessed the full weight of American history compressed into a single building. Tyler ran ahead, his small footsteps echoing on floorboards worn smooth by generations of work. I followed slower, my limp more pronounced in the cold. Shrapnel from an IED outside Kandahar, a gift that would remind me of Afghanistan for the rest of my life. Inside, the forge smelled like it always had: coal and iron and sweat and time. The great anvil sat in the center of the space, 250 pounds of solid steel, the face worn into a gentle depression by thousands of hours of metalwork. Tools hung on the walls like a museum of honest labor: hammers and tongs and chisels, each one shaped by the hand that had used it, each one carrying the memory of the men who'd built their lives here. "Grandpa," Tyler said, his voice small in the high-ceilinged space. "What's that?" He pointed to a wooden panel in the floor, partially hidden under a workbench. I'd seen it 1,000 times without really seeing it, just part of the floor, part of the background. But Tyler had the eyes of someone looking at the world fresh, seeing things adults had learned to overlook. I knelt beside him, my knee protesting the movement. The panel was roughly 4 feet by 6 feet, the seams nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them. I ran my fingers along the edge, feeling the subtle gap. "Help me move this bench," I said. Together we shifted the heavy workbench, tools rattling. With the bench moved, the panel was fully visible. I found the hidden latch Samuel had shown me when I was not much older than Tyler. The panel lifted with a groan of old wood, revealing darkness below. Tyler's eyes went wide. "What is it?" "History," I said. A flashlight hung on the wall nearby. I clicked it on and pointed the beam down into the hidden space. 4 feet deep, maybe 6 feet long, lined with old blankets that had rotted into fragments. The wood was different down there, older, the tool marks more primitive. "This forge was built in 1837 by a man named Elijah Ironwood," I told Tyler. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather. He was a free black man in Tennessee before the Civil War, a blacksmith like Samuel, like me. I paused, choosing my words carefully. 8 years old was young for this history, but not too young. Before the war, there were people in this country who were enslaved, owned by other people, forced to work, treated worse than animals. Some of them tried to escape, tried to run north where they could be free. Tyler nodded slowly. We learned about that in school, the Underground Railroad. That's right. And this forge, this building we're standing in, it was part of that railroad. Elijah hid people here, families, children like you. He'd hide them in this space until it was safe to move them further north. I shone the light into the corners of the hidden room. In one corner, I could just make out scratches in the wood. Names, maybe. Or marks to count days. Or prayers carved by terrified people hoping they'd survive long enough to see freedom. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, staring into the darkness. Then he looked up at me with eyes that suddenly seemed older than 8 years. "Grandpa," he said, "that makes this place important, really important. You can't sell it." Out of the mouths of children. I pulled Tyler close, and for the first time since Samuel's funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. But purpose and reality are different things. And reality arrived 2 weeks later in the form of a woman in a white Mercedes SUV. I was in the driveway, rebuilding the carburetor on a 1967 Mustang I'd been restoring for 3 years. The kind of project that keeps your hands busy and your mind from circling the drain of loss. The Mercedes rolled to a stop with the quiet precision of German engineering and excessive money. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. Early 50s maybe, though it was hard to tell under the perfectly applied makeup and professionally styled silver blonde hair, designer pantsuit, heels too expensive for a gravel driveway, and a leather portfolio clutched like a shield or a weapon. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Ironwood?" she said, extending a hand. "I'm Victoria Westbrook. I live in Grayson Hills Estates. I'm the HOA compliance director." I wiped grease from my hands on a shop rag before shaking. The HOA, the Homeowners Association that had sprouted up around my property like mushrooms after rain. 5 years ago, this had all been farmland and forest. Now it was McMansions and manicured lawns, and people who thought grass height was worth measuring with rulers. "What can I do for you, Ms. Westbrook?" Her smile brightened, which somehow made it colder. "Please call me Victoria." I wanted to stop by personally. First, to offer my condolences on your grandfather's passing. Samuel was quite a character. The way she said character made it clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. Second, she continued, reaching into her portfolio, "I need to discuss some concerns the association has regarding your property." She pulled out a document that looked like it had been prepared by lawyers who charged by the word. 9 pages, single-spaced, with the kind of official letterhead designed to intimidate. "Notice of violation," it read across the top in bold letters. I took it, scanning the contents with growing disbelief. The forge apparently violated aesthetic standards for the neighborhood. It detracted from property values. It constituted a potential safety hazard. It was incompatible with community standards. The deadline was 60 days. Submit a demolition plan or face fines of $500 per day. The fines would increase to $2,000 per day after 90 days. There was language about liens and foreclosure and legal action. I looked up from the document to find Victoria watching me with the expression of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. "You want me to tear down a 187-year-old building because it doesn't match your subdivision's aesthetic? We're cultivating a certain type of community here," she said. And there it was, the barely concealed contempt in the word certain type. "I'm sure you understand. Property values, maintaining standards. People like us need to uphold these things. People like us." Her eyes traveled over my work clothes, my oil-stained jeans, my steel-toed boots. Her nose wrinkled slightly, as if I smelled bad, though the only thing she could smell was honest work. "This forge was built before your great-great-grandmother was born," I said, keeping my voice level through an effort of will. "It's part of American history. The Underground Railroad. People died to protect that building." Victoria's smile never wavered. "I'm sure that's very interesting, but historical sentiment doesn't override community covenants. You signed the HOA agreement when the subdivision was developed." "I didn't sign anything. This property has been in my family for almost 200 years. The previous owner's signature is binding, she said smoothly. When the development company purchased the surrounding land, all adjacent properties fell under the covenant structure. It's all quite legal, I assure you. She handed me her business card. White, expensive cardstock, raised lettering. I'd like to resolve this amicably, Mr. Ironwood. 60 days. After that, I'm afraid things become much more complicated. She walked back to her Mercedes, heels clicking on gravel. The engine purred to life, and she drove away trailing a scent of vanilla air freshener and barely disguised malice. I stood in my driveway, holding the violation notice and her business card, feeling something I hadn't felt since Afghanistan, that cold clarity that comes when you realize someone has just declared war on you, and you have to decide whether to surrender or fight. The first instinct was to call Jennifer. She'd tell me to comply, to not make waves, to take the path of least resistance. The second instinct was to ignore it, pretend it would go away if I just kept my head down and did nothing. But I'd learned something in 2 tours overseas and 32 years in the automotive industry. Bullies don't stop when you ignore them. They escalate. I needed information. I needed to understand what I was facing. And I needed to talk to someone who dealt with the HOA before. Rachel Torres lived 3 houses down from me, on the edge where the subdivision met the old farmland. Single mother, nurse at the county hospital, the kind of neighbor who waved when she drove past and didn't complain about my early morning hammer work. I'd helped her son with a school project about blacksmithing 6 months ago, and she'd repaid the favor with homemade tamales that reminded me of Diane's cooking. I found her in her front yard that evening, planting flowers while her son played basketball in the driveway. She looked up as I approached, and her smile faded when she saw the expression on my face. Rachel, I said, can we talk about the HOA? 20 minutes later, we sat at her kitchen table with coffee neither of us was drinking. Rachel had pulled out a folder thick with documents, violation notices, fine assessments, threatening letters. 47 different violations filed against 12 households in the past 6 months. She's targeting people, Rachel said quietly. Older residents, minorities, anyone who doesn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should look like. My mailbox was too decorative. The Chens got cited for having wind chimes. Mrs. Patterson, she's 83, got fined for having a garden shed that was the wrong color. Have any of these held up? I asked. Most people just comply, Rachel said. They're scared. Victoria's married to money, she's got lawyers on retainer, and she acts like she has all the power in the world. But does she? Rachel hesitated, then leaned forward. My friend Lisa works as a paralegal at a law firm in Nashville. I showed her some of these notices. She says half of them are legally questionable. The HOA covenant doesn't actually give them the authority they claim to have. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Marcus, there's something else. Lisa did some digging. Victoria's husband, Richard Westbrook, he works for Summit Ridge Development. They're a commercial real estate company. And they've been buying up farmland east of here. Big parcels, there's talk about a shopping center development. Your property, it sits right in the middle of the acquisition zone they'd need. The mug warmed my hands, but the coffee had gone cold. I stared at it, watching my reflection in the dark surface, and felt the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't about aesthetics or property values or community standards. This was about clearing land for profit. This was about making me miserable enough to sell. What do I do? I asked. Rachel met my eyes. You fight, and you don't fight alone. That night, I stood in the forge long after sunset. The building was dark except for moonlight streaming through high windows. I ran my hands over the anvil, feeling the worn surface where 4 generations of ironwood men had shaped metal and shaped their lives. On the wall, I found the journal, Elijah's journal, preserved in a wooden box Samuel had built specially for it. Leather-bound, pages yellowed with age, the handwriting elegant despite being written by a man whose formal education had been limited. I opened it carefully, reading by flashlight. The entries were sparse, practical notes about metalwork mostly. But every few pages there were other entries, coded references to visitors, supplies moved, dangers avoided. One entry stopped me cold, dated March 1862. Tonight they came with dogs and torches. I feared we would burn, but the family hiding below stayed silent even when the baby wanted to cry. I stayed at my anvil, hammering, showing no fear. The men with torches saw only a blacksmith at work. They moved on. The family moved north at dawn. The baby is free now. We endured. At the bottom of the entry, in different ink, added later perhaps. What we build with our hands, we defend with our hearts. The forge is not iron and stone. It is freedom made real. I read those words 3 times, 4 times, until they were burned into my memory. Samuel had shown me this journal when I was 12. The same day he taught me about the hidden compartment. He'd never said much about it, just handed it to me and said, "This is who we are. Never forget." I'd forgotten, in a way, gotten caught up in careers and raising Jennifer and taking care of Diane during her illness. The forge had become background, a piece of my life I took for granted, like the old oaks or the farmhouse, something that would always be there. But Victoria Westbrook had just reminded me that nothing lasts forever unless someone fights for it. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of Elijah's entry. Then I carefully returned the journal to its box. I had 60 days. 60 days to figure out how to fight a woman with money and lawyers and no conscience. 60 days to protect a building that had sheltered freedom seekers when the world was trying to kill them. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse. It was one of those old stone buildings that looked like it had been there since before the Civil War, because it had. Inside smelled like old paper and furniture polish and bureaucracy. The records office was in the basement, presided over by a woman in her 60s who looked at me over reading glasses when I approached her desk. "I need to see property records," I said, "for my land and the surrounding area." She nodded, not asking questions, and led me to a computer terminal. For the next 4 hours, I dug through records. Original land grants, deed restrictions, zoning histories, the HOA covenant documents. What I found was illuminating. The land my property sat on had been granted to Elijah Ironwood in 1837 as a homestead claim. The deed was clear: working forge to remain in perpetuity, agricultural exemption, historical preservation clause from a Tennessee law passed in 1965. The HOA covenant, when I finally tracked it down, was from 5 years ago. It claimed jurisdiction over all properties within the subdivision boundaries. But there was a problem. Several problems, actually. The covenant explicitly stated it couldn't override existing deed restrictions. It acknowledged historical preservation laws. And most importantly, it required unanimous consent from all property owners. I'd never signed anything. Samuel had never signed anything, which meant, unless I was badly misreading the legal language, the HOA had no actual authority over my property. I printed everything, 37 pages of documents that might, possibly, save my grandfather's forge. As I was leaving, the records clerk stopped me, the older black woman who'd helped me navigate the computer system. "Mr. Ironwood," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone, "I've been watching your name pop up in searches all morning. I want you to know something." She pulled up a screen on her computer, typed quickly, and turned it so I could see. A list of property searches, all conducted by the same name, Victoria Westbrook. "She's been researching 8 other properties in this county," the clerk said, "all of them historically significant, all of them owned by black families or working-class folks. Your property is just the latest." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my grandfather's farm was taken by people like her, 50 years ago. They didn't have fancy HOA rules back then. They just had lawyers and pressure, and the ability to make life hell until people gave up." She met my eyes, and I saw something there that made my chest tight. Determination, solidarity. Don't give up, Mr. Ironwood. Some of us remember what it means when powerful people try to erase history. I drove home with 37 pages of documents and a growing sense that I wasn't fighting this battle alone after all. But I also had a growing sense of how big this fight was going to be. Victoria Westbrook wasn't just a busybody with a power complex. She was part of something larger, something more organized and more dangerous. That evening, Jennifer called. "Tyler wants to come spend the weekend," she said, "if that's okay with you." "More than okay," I said. "Dad," she said, and her voice had that careful tone again, "have you thought more about selling? I've been looking at retirement communities near us. There's one with a woodworking shop and—" "Jen," I interrupted gently, "I'm not selling." Silence on the line. "Then why not?" "Because Tyler asked me a question. He asked why this place matters, and I realized I've been so caught up in grief, I forgot to show him what we're grieving for. Another pause. Dad, I don't understand. I know, but maybe this weekend you will. Friday evening, Jennifer's car pulled up with Tyler practically bouncing in the back seat. He ran to me, and I caught him in a hug that made my back protest, but my heart feel lighter than it had in months. After dinner, after Jennifer and David had settled into the guest room, I took Tyler out to the forge. The sun was setting, painting the old building in golden shadow. I opened the door, and we stepped into the space that smelled like history and iron and family. I want to teach you something, I told him. Something your great-great-great-great-grandfather would have taught his son. We spent the next hour at the anvil. I showed him how to hold the hammer, how to let its weight do the work, how to read the color of hot metal. We made a simple hook. Nothing fancy. But Tyler's face when he dunked the finished piece in water and watched it steam, that look of pride and wonder, that was everything. Grandpa, he said, holding his hook like it was made of gold, can we do this again tomorrow? Every day you're here, I promised. Later, after Tyler was asleep, Jennifer found me on the porch. We sat in silence for a while, watching fireflies in the darkness. Mom would have loved this, she said finally. Seeing Tyler learn the forge, she did love it, I said. Your mother understood why this place matters. She just didn't live long enough to see me remember. Jennifer was quiet. Then what changed? After the funeral, you seemed so lost. Now you seem... I got angry, I said simply. Someone told me I had to destroy this place, and I realized some things are worth fighting for. Even if you're scared, even if you're alone. You're not alone, Dad. I looked at her, saw Diane in her face, saw the strength that ran through the women in my family like iron through rock. I know, I said. I'm starting to figure that out. The weekend passed too quickly. Tyler made 2 more hooks, a small knife blade, and burned himself once when he got too close to the forge fire. I bandaged it, and he wore the small blister like a badge of honor. Jennifer watched us work, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not full understanding, maybe, but the beginning of it. Monday morning came with a certified letter. Another notice from Victoria Westbrook and the HOA. This one was different, more aggressive. It referenced county building codes, safety regulations, environmental concerns. It demanded immediate access for inspection. It threatened daily fines starting immediately. I called the county building inspector's office. They had no record of any complaints about my property, no scheduled inspections, no concerns on file, which meant Victoria was manufacturing violations to create a paper trail, making it look official, look legitimate when it was all smoke and mirrors. I needed help, real help, legal help. But lawyers cost money, and my savings had been devastated by Diane's medical bills and the lean years after she died. Rachel, when I called her, had an answer. There's a lawyer in town, retired mostly, but he still takes cases that interest him. James Castellano. He specializes in civil rights and property law. What are the chances he'll help me? Rachel laughed. Marcus, Jimmy Castellano marched in Selma. He fought housing discrimination in the 70s. He hates bullies more than anyone I've ever met. If you've got a good case, he'll help you. If you've got a great case, he'll do it for free just for the satisfaction of watching justice happen. Jimmy Castellano's office was in an old house on the edge of downtown. Inside looked like a law library had exploded. Books everywhere. Case files stacked on every surface. Photos on the walls from 50 years of fighting the good fight. The man himself was 71, with silver hair, sharp eyes, and hands that still showed the scars from being beaten by police during a protest in 1963. He listened to my story without interrupting. I showed him the violation notices, the property records, the HOA covenant documents. I told him about Victoria Westbrook and her husband's development company. I showed him Elijah's journal entry and explained the forge's history. When I finished, Jimmy sat back in his chair and smiled. It was the smile of a predator who'd just spotted prey. Mr. Ironwood, he said, do you know what you have here? A legal nightmare? No. You have an open and shut case of tortious interference with property rights. You have documented historical protections. You have a pattern of harassment. And most importantly, you have an HOA claiming authority it legally doesn't possess. He stood, walked to a shelf, and pulled down a thick book, Tennessee Code Annotated, Historical Preservation Act, Any structure over 100 years old with documented historical significance receives automatic state protection. No HOA, no municipality, no private entity can force demolition without state approval. And state approval requires proving the structure is beyond repair and poses imminent danger. Is my forge beyond repair? From what you've described, it's probably the most structurally sound building in the entire county. So what do? We file a motion to dismiss their enforcement action. We file a harassment complaint. We request a restraining order. And then, Mr. Ironwood, we make them regret they ever heard your name. I sat across from this 71-year-old civil rights warrior, and for the first time since receiving that first violation notice, I felt something other than fear and anger. I felt hope. What's your retainer? I asked. Jimmy waved a hand dismissively. I'm mostly retired. I take cases that matter now, not cases that pay. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather hid freedom seekers. I marched for freedom. Some fights transcend money. But nothing. I'll need $5,000 to cover filing fees and expenses. That's it. And if we win, which we will, the HOA pays all attorney fees. It's beautiful when the law works the way it's supposed to. I had $5,000. Barely. It would wipe out most of what was left in my savings. But I thought about Tyler's face when he made that first hook. I thought about Elijah's words in that journal. I thought about Samuel teaching me that some things matter more than money or safety or comfort. Let's do it, I said. We shook hands and the war began in earnest. That night I called Jennifer. I told her I'd hired a lawyer. I told her I was fighting. She was quiet for a long moment. Dad, she said finally, I talked to David. We want to help. Financially, whatever you need. Jen, no, Dad, you were right. Tyler's been talking nonstop about the forge, about history, about his great-great-great-great-grandfather who helped escape slaves. He understands now. So do I. Her voice cracked slightly. Mom died too fast. We didn't get to fight for her. But we can fight for this. Let us fight for this. I couldn't speak for a moment. When I did, my voice was rough. Thank you, sweetheart. That's what family does, she said. 3 days later, Jimmy filed our legal response. Motion to dismiss based on historical protections. Harassment complaint citing 14 false safety reports. Request for restraining order to prevent property access. Court hearing scheduled for 6 weeks. But Victoria Westbrook wasn't the type to wait for courts. 2 days after Jimmy filed, I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of engines in my driveway. I looked out to see 3 trucks with Sentinel Property Protection logos, 6 men with flashlights walking my property line, shining lights in my windows. I called the sheriff's office. The deputy who responded was apologetic but clear. They're not on your property, sir. They're on the easement. That's technically legal. Even at 3 a.m? Not illegal, he said with a shrug that told me he didn't like it but couldn't stop it. The harassment had escalated, and I realized, with cold clarity, that I wasn't just fighting a legal battle. I was fighting a psychological war designed to break me before we ever reached court. I stood in my driveway at 3:30 a.m, watching those trucks idle with their lights pointing at my home, and I made a decision. If they wanted to play psychological warfare, I'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan learning from experts. If they wanted to break me, they'd picked the wrong 61-year-old veteran. The war had begun, and I wasn't surrendering. The morning of the court hearing arrived with the kind of bright November sunshine that made everything look deceptively peaceful. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting my tie for the 3rd time, my hands shaking in ways that had nothing to do with age or PTSD. This was different from combat anxiety. In Afghanistan, I'd known who the enemy was and what weapons they carried. Today, I was walking into a courtroom where the enemy wore expensive suits and carried briefcases full of manufactured lies. Jennifer had stayed overnight, insisting she'd drive me to the courthouse. Tyler sat at my kitchen table, drawing pictures of the forge while we waited. He'd made me promise to tell him everything that happened, every detail, because as he'd said with the seriousness only an 8-year-old could muster, this is history happening right now, Grandpa. The kid wasn't wrong. What happened today would determine whether the Ironwood Forge stood for another century or fell to a shopping center development that would be forgotten within 20 years. Jimmy Castellano arrived at 7:30, carrying a briefcase that looked older than both of us combined, and wearing a suit that had probably been expensive in 1975. He accepted coffee and reviewed his notes one final time, occasionally muttering to himself in the way lawyers do when they're running through arguments in their heads. "Ready?" he asked, looking up at me with eyes that had seen 50 years of courtroom battles. "As I'll ever be," I said. The drive to Grayson County Courthouse took 20 minutes through morning traffic that seemed heavier than usual, as if the entire county had decided today was the day to conduct business downtown. Jennifer drove in silence, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Tyler peppered Jimmy with questions about how trials worked and whether there'd be a jury like on television. "No jury today," Jimmy explained patiently. "This is a hearing before Judge Catherine Reynolds. She'll review the evidence and make a ruling. If we're lucky, she'll dismiss the HOA's enforcement action entirely. If we're very lucky, she'll sanction them for filing frivolous complaints." "What if we're unlucky?" Tyler asked. "Then we appeal," Jimmy said simply. "And we keep appealing until we win or run out of courts to appeal to. But son, I don't plan on being unlucky today." The courthouse steps were already crowded when we arrived. News of the hearing had spread through Grayson County's grapevine with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. I recognized faces from the neighborhood. Rachel Torres with a group of supporters carrying signs that read, "Protect our history and property rights matter." Mrs. Patterson, 83 years old and fierce, wearing a t-shirt that said, "I stand with Ironwood." But there were other faces too. Residents I'd never met, wearing business casual clothes and expressions of concern. Clearly Team Victoria and the HOA's vision of aesthetic harmony. They clustered near the entrance like they owned the building, which, given Victoria's confidence, they probably believed they did. Victoria Westbrook stood at the center of that group, immaculate in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my truck. Her lawyer, Bradford Pierce from a prestigious Nashville firm, stood beside her reviewing documents with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from winning too many cases against outmatched opponents. He was mid-50s, distinguished silver temples, $1,000 suit, and the smile of a shark who just spotted a swimmer with a cut foot. Jimmy saw them and snorted. Pierce. Should have known Victoria would hire the most expensive asshole in Tennessee. "You know him? Opposing counsel on a housing discrimination case in '89. He's good, I'll give him that. Completely unethical, but good. Watch yourself around him, Marcus. Men like Pierce don't fight fair." We entered the courthouse and passed through security, the metal detector beeping at my belt buckle and the shrapnel still lodged in my knee. The security guard, an older veteran who recognized my VFW cap, waved me through with a nod of understanding that needed no words. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and smelling of old furniture polish, and the accumulated tension of thousands of legal battles fought within its walls. Judge Catherine Reynolds' bench dominated the space, elevated and imposing, the American flag and Tennessee state flag flanking it like sentries. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table. Jimmy spread out his files with the methodical precision of a man who'd done this so many times. The routine had become ritual. Across the aisle, Pierce did the same, though his files were color-coded and organized in expensive leather portfolios that matched his briefcase. The bailiff stood. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Catherine Reynolds presiding." Judge Reynolds entered through a side door, her black robe swishing with authority earned over 20 years on the bench. She was 62, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. I'd done my research. Reynolds had a reputation for fairness, but zero tolerance for nonsense. She'd dismissed frivolous cases and sanctioned attorneys who wasted her time. If we had a fair shot at justice, it would be in her courtroom. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Let's begin. Case number 24-379. Grayson Hills HOA versus Marcus Ironwood regarding property violations and enforcement action. Mr. Pierce, you filed the complaint. Present your case." Pierce stood with theatrical smoothness, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, thank you. This is a straightforward matter of community standards enforcement. My client, the Grayson Hills Homeowners Association, has documented multiple violations of clearly stated covenants designed to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics." He clicked a remote and a screen descended behind him. PowerPoint presentation. Of course, the first slide showed the forge from an angle that made it look decrepit and dangerous, shot during golden hour to maximize shadows and emphasize weathering. The structure in question, Pierce continued, is an industrial building incompatible with residential zoning. It poses documented safety hazards, detracts from property values as confirmed by our real estate expert, and violates multiple covenant provisions that Mr. Ironwood agreed to when— Objection, Jimmy said, standing slowly. Mr. Ironwood never agreed to any covenants. His property predates the subdivision by 187 years. We'll get to that, Judge Reynolds said. Mr. Pierce, continue, but stick to facts, not rhetoric. Pierce's smile never faltered. Your Honor, the covenant documents clearly state that all properties within the subdivision boundaries fall under HOA jurisdiction. The previous owner's signature on the original development agreement binds all subsequent owners. He advanced to the next slide, showing the signature page from the development agreement. There it was in black and white. A signature. But not mine. Not Samuel's. Someone named James Patterson from 1998, 26 years ago when the land around my property had been sold off. Mr. Ironwood has been served with proper notice, Pierce continued. 60 days to comply, with extensions offered in good faith. He has refused all reasonable attempts at resolution. The HOA is left with no choice but to enforce community standards through fines and, if necessary, compulsory demolition. Compulsory demolition. The words hung in the air like a threat, which was exactly how Pierce intended them. I felt Jennifer's hand find mine under the table, squeezing tight. Furthermore, Pierce said, advancing through slides showing manufactured violations, county inspectors have documented safety concerns, structural instability, potential fire hazards, environmental contamination risks. The HOA has a duty to protect the community. Those reports are fabricated, Jimmy said quietly. But Judge Reynolds heard him. Mr. Castellano, you'll have your turn. Mr. Pierce, how much longer? Just concluding, Your Honor. Pierce turned to face the judge directly. This case is about whether one individual can flout community standards that everyone else follows, whether nostalgia and sentiment trump legal agreements and public safety. We ask this court to enforce the HOA's authority and order compliance within 30 days. He sat down with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd just delivered a closing argument worthy of law school textbooks. Judge Reynolds turned to our table. Mr. Castellano, your response. Jimmy stood, and I saw why he'd been fighting civil rights cases for 50 years. He didn't have Pierce's polish or expensive suits or theatrical presentation, but he had something Pierce would never possess. The moral authority of someone who'd been beaten by police for defending principles and kept fighting anyway. Your Honor, Jimmy began, and his voice carried the weight of history. Mr. Pierce has presented a case built entirely on legal fiction and manufactured violations. Let me address the facts he conveniently omitted. Jimmy pulled out the property deed I'd found in the courthouse records. This land was granted to Elijah Ironwood in 1837. The deed contains specific language, working forge to remain in perpetuity, agricultural exemption, historical preservation protections under 1865 Tennessee law. He walked to the bench and handed Judge Reynolds the document. She reviewed it carefully, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. That HOA covenant Mr. Pierce mentioned, Jimmy continued. It explicitly states it cannot override existing deed restrictions. Page 7, paragraph 3, subsection B. I have the highlighted copy here. He handed another document to the judge, then turned to address Pierce directly. The signature you claim binds my client? That was from a property transaction in 1998 involving land adjacent to but not including the Ironwood parcel. The surveyor's maps are clear. My client's property was specifically excluded from that agreement. Pierce shifted slightly in his seat. First sign of discomfort. As for those safety concerns, Jimmy said, pulling out inspection reports with the satisfaction of a magician revealing his trick. County Building Inspector Mike Rodriguez conducted 3 separate inspections at my client's request. All passed. Fire marshal passed. Environmental health passed. Every single concern the HOA raised was investigated by actual professionals and found to be without merit. He placed the reports on Pierce's table with more force than necessary. The violations are fabricated, Your Honor. This isn't about safety or standards. This is about harassment designed to force a sale. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Castellano. I can prove it, Your Honor. Jimmy pulled out the property search records the county clerk had shown me. Victoria Westbrook has researched 8 other historically significant properties in this county, all owned by minorities or working-class families, all targeted with similar harassment campaigns. My client's property sits in the middle of a shopping center development zone mapped by Summit Ridge Development, a company owned by Richard Westbrook. Pierce stood. Objection. Mr. Westbrook's business interests are irrelevant to this proceeding. They're entirely relevant, Jimmy shot back, when the HOA compliance director is married to the developer who needs my client's land. This is conspiracy to violate property rights for commercial gain. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel. Order. Mr. Castellano, do you have evidence of coordination between the HOA and the development company? Working on it, Your Honor. But the pattern is clear. Targeted harassment, manufactured violations, pressure to sell, classic intimidation tactics. Judge Reynolds studied the documents before her, the silence stretching until it felt like the courtroom itself was holding its breath. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Pierce, I'm troubled by these deed protections. Your covenant explicitly acknowledges it cannot override existing restrictions. How do you reconcile that with your enforcement action? Pierce stood, smoother now. Your Honor, those deed restrictions are antiquated. They don't reflect modern land use standards or contemporary legal frameworks. We believe they've been superseded by current zoning regulations. Belief isn't law, Judge Reynolds said dryly. Mr. Castellano, what about the Historical Preservation Act you mentioned? Jimmy handed her the statute. Tennessee Historical Preservation Act of 1965. Any structure over 100 years old, with documented historical significance, receives automatic state protection. The Ironwood Forge is 187 years old and was a documented Underground Railroad station. I have preliminary approval from the State Historical Society for National Register designation. National Register? Judge Reynolds' eyebrows rose. That would create federal protection. Exactly, Your Honor. Which means this court doesn't even have jurisdiction over forced demolition. Only the State Historical Commission can authorize removal of a protected structure, and only after proving it's beyond repair and poses imminent danger. Judge Reynolds turned to Pierce. Were you aware of the historical designation application? Pierce's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. We were not informed of any such application. Because it's not your business to be informed, Jimmy said. Property owners don't need HOA permission to apply for historical protection. Judge Reynolds made notes on her legal pad, and I could see her mind working through the implications. When she looked up, her expression had shifted from neutral to something approaching skepticism toward the HOA's case. I'm going to call a recess, she said. 1 hour. Mr. Pierce, I suggest you consult with your client about these deed restrictions. Mr. Castellano, get me that historical designation documentation. We reconvene at 11:30. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted in conversation. Jimmy turned to me with the closest thing to a smile I'd seen on his face all morning. We're winning, he said quietly. She sees through Pierce's bullshit. The hour passed with agonizing slowness. We retreated to a conference room where Jennifer had brought sandwiches no one felt like eating. Tyler asked questions I barely heard, my mind replaying every moment of the hearing, looking for cracks in our case or weaknesses Pierce might exploit. Rachel found us and reported what she'd overheard in the hallway. Victoria and Pierce had argued, their voices carrying despite attempts at discretion. Pierce had apparently not been told about the deed restrictions or the historical designation application. Victoria had withheld information from her own attorney, likely because she knew it destroyed her case. That's good for us, right? Rachel asked. Very good, Jimmy confirmed. Means Pierce is flying blind. He can't effectively argue against protections he didn't know existed. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. Pierce looked irritated in a way his professional mask couldn't quite hide. Victoria sat rigid in the gallery, her leather portfolio clutched like a life preserver. The confidence from this morning had cracked. Judge Reynolds resumed her seat and wasted no time. Mr. Castellano, I've reviewed your historical documentation. The State Historical Society's preliminary approval is compelling. I'm also troubled by the deed restriction issues Mr. Pierce's client failed to disclose. She turned to Pierce with an expression that made experienced attorneys nervous. Mr. Pierce, I'm issuing a preliminary injunction. All HOA enforcement actions against Mr. Ironwood's property are stayed pending resolution of the historical designation application. Additionally, I'm ordering a full audit of the HOA's enforcement patterns to determine if there's systematic discrimination. Your Honor, Pierce started, but Judge Reynolds cut him off. I'm not finished. If this audit reveals targeting of protected classes or coordination with commercial interests, I'll refer this matter to federal prosecutors. The Fair Housing Act has teeth, and I won't tolerate its violation in my jurisdiction. She looked at me directly. Mr. Ironwood, you're entitled to attorney fees under Tennessee's frivolous litigation statute. I'm awarding you $8,000 to cover Mr. Castellano's work to date. The HOA will pay within 30 days. The gavel fell, and for the first time in 2 months, I could breathe fully. We'd won. Not completely, not finally, but enough to stop the immediate threat and buy time for the historical designation to come through. Outside the courthouse, the celebration was subdued but real. Rachel hugged me tight enough to crack ribs. Tyler jumped up and down shouting, "We won! We won!" like he'd just witnessed his team score a touchdown. Jennifer cried quietly, the stress of months finally releasing. But Jimmy pulled me aside, his expression serious despite the victory. Marcus, this isn't over. We won the battle, not the war. Victoria's going to appeal, and even if the appeal fails, desperate people do desperate things. What are you saying? I'm saying watch your back. We just cost her husband's company millions of dollars. People have been hurt for less. The words settled over me like a cold blanket, despite the November sunshine. Victory in court was one thing, but Victoria and Richard Westbrook had already shown they'd use intimidation and manufactured violations. What would they do now that legal tactics had failed? I didn't have to wait long for an answer. 3 nights after the hearing, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. 2:17 in the morning, according to the clock beside my bed. I lay perfectly still, listening to footsteps crunching through glass. Multiple people moving through my house with the kind of careless noise that suggested they wanted me to know they were there. My service pistol was in the safe across the room. 10 seconds to reach it, another 10 to open the safe. 20 seconds I might not have. Training took over. I rolled silently off the bed, using the mattress as cover. Grabbed my phone from the nightstand, dialed 911 with fingers that remembered this kind of fear from Afghanistan. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Home invasion, I whispered. 3 intruders, maybe more. Ironwood property, 1500 Oak Ridge Road. Police are on the way, sir. Stay on the line. Are you in immediate danger? Before I could answer, my bedroom door crashed open. 3 figures in ski masks, the lead one carrying a crowbar. His voice was muffled, but the words were clear. Get out! This is your last warning. Next time we won't be so polite. The crowbar swung and my window exploded outward, glass spraying into the night. The message was delivered, the threat unmistakable. They turned and ran, footsteps thundering down my stairs. I stayed low, heart pounding, until I heard car doors slam and an engine roar to life. Then I was moving, combat instincts overriding caution. I reached the window in time to see a dark SUV tearing down my driveway. No plates visible in the darkness. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived 12 minutes later with 3 patrol cars and enough lights to make my property look like a crime scene, which it was. She found me sitting on my porch steps, service pistol now in my lap, hands shaking with post-adrenaline crash that I remembered too well from Afghanistan. Marcus, she said, kneeling in front of me. You hurt? Just angry, I said, and tired. So goddamn tired of this. Rodriguez examined the damage with professional efficiency. The broken window, the jimmied back door they'd used to enter, boot prints in my flower bed that Jennifer had planted last spring. She called in forensics and took my statement while I tried to stop my hands from shaking and failed. This is escalation, she said after I told her everything. Court loss 2 days ago, home invasion tonight. That's not coincidence. Can you prove it? Not yet. But Marcus, I'm opening a full investigation. This isn't HOA harassment anymore. This is aggravated burglary, criminal threatening. If I can tie this to Victoria or Richard Westbrook, they're looking at serious prison time. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I want to put you in protective custody. No. Marcus. Elena, if I run, they win. They get exactly what they want. me scared and gone, and this property available for their shopping center. Rodriguez sighed but didn't argue further. She knew stubbornness when she saw it. Instead, she made calls, and within an hour, I had 2 deputies stationed outside my property, with orders to watch for any suspicious activity. Jennifer arrived at 5 in the morning, having driven from Nashville the moment I called her. She took one look at the broken window and burst into tears. Not the quiet crying from the courthouse. This was the kind of crying that comes from fear and fury mixed together. "Dad, you can't stay here, please. Come stay with us until this is over." "This will never be over if I leave," I said. "They'll keep pushing until someone pushes back harder. And besides, where would I go? This is my home. It's not safe." I looked at my daughter and saw Diane in her face. Both of them strong women who'd spent their lives trying to protect the men they loved from dangers those men couldn't avoid. Life isn't safe, Jen. But some things are worth the risk. She wanted to argue. I could see it in her face. But she also knew I was right. This fight had moved beyond property rights into something more fundamental. The question of whether bullies won by making threats, or whether ordinary people could stand their ground and fight back. The sun rose over my damaged house, and the forge standing untouched behind it. I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window, watching deputies patrol my property. And something shifted inside me. The fear was still there. The exhaustion was still there. But underneath it all was something cold and hard and utterly unbreakable. They'd made a mistake coming into my home. They'd crossed a line from harassment into violence, and violence was a language I understood better than they could imagine. I'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan learning how to stay calm when people tried to kill me. I'd learned patience and planning, and the art of turning enemy aggression into strategic advantage. If Victoria and Richard Westbrook wanted war, they'd just declared it against the wrong veteran. I called Jimmy and told him everything. His response was immediate. "We're going nuclear, Marcus. Civil rights lawsuit. Criminal conspiracy charges. I'm calling the FBI field office in Nashville. This is federal territory now." Then I called Sheriff Rodriguez back. "Elena, I need you to do something for me, something probably outside normal procedure." "What?" "I want to set a trap. Use me as bait. Let them think they've broken me, that I'm scared and vulnerable. And when they make their next move, we document everything." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus, that's dangerous. These people have already shown they're willing to commit violence. Then let's make sure that violence gets them a federal prison sentence, instead of another harassment complaint that goes nowhere." Another pause. "Then tell me your plan." Over the next hour, we worked out the details. I'd stop fighting publicly, act defeated, maybe even float rumors I was considering selling, give Victoria and Richard enough rope to hang themselves with. Meanwhile, Rodriguez would coordinate with federal investigators to build a RICO case, conspiracy charges, anything that would bring the full weight of the law down on them. It was risky. It required patience I wasn't sure I possessed after 2 months of constant harassment. But it was also smart. And survival in war zones had taught me that smart beats strong every single time. 3 days later, I attended a neighborhood meeting Rachel had organized. 50 residents packed into the community center, ostensibly to discuss the court case and what it meant for property rights in Grayson Hills. But really, it was a referendum on Victoria's reign as HOA compliance director. I stood before those 50 people and told my story. Not the legal details, but the human story. The forge's history. Elijah hiding freedom seekers. Samuel teaching me that some things matter more than money. My wife Diane making me promise not to let them take what we'd built. Tyler discovering the hidden compartment and asking why this place mattered. When I finished, the room sat in silence so complete you could hear the ventilation system humming. Then Mrs. Patterson stood, 83 years old and fierce. "I got the same treatment," she said. "Fined for my garden shed, threatened with liens. I didn't have a fancy lawyer, so I just painted the shed the color they demanded. But I've regretted it every day since." Others spoke up. The Chens about their wind chimes, a young couple about their mailbox, Rachel about her property being photographed without permission. A pattern emerged of Victoria targeting anyone who didn't fit her vision of conformity and compliance. By the end of the meeting, 17 families had joined our coalition. 17 families willing to file their own complaints, share their stories, help build the federal case that Victoria's harassment campaign was systematic and discriminatory. But victory came with cost. As we left the community center, Victoria was waiting in the parking lot. Her white Mercedes gleamed under sodium lights like a predator's eyes in darkness. She stood beside it, no longer bothering with her fake smile or professional demeanor. "You think you've won," she said, her voice carrying across the empty lot. "But you have no idea what you've started. My husband has resources you can't imagine, connections you can't fight. This doesn't end until you're gone." She got in her car and drove away, leaving those words hanging in the cold November air like a threat and a promise. Rachel touched my arm. "Marcus, she meant that. You need to be careful." "I know," I said, "but careful and scared are different things. I'm done being scared." That night, alone in my house with deputies outside and broken glass still not repaired, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list. Every incident, every threat, every manufactured violation and harassment tactic Victoria had used. 2 months of warfare documented in excruciating detail. Then I started a second list. Evidence we still needed. Proof of coordination between Victoria and Richard. Documentation of the development plans requiring my property. Connection between the home invasion and the Westbrooks. Financial records showing HOA money going to Richard's contractors. The list became my obsession, my battle plan, my roadmap to justice. Because Jimmy was right. We'd won the battle in Judge Reynolds' courtroom, but the war was still raging, and it would only end when Victoria and Richard Westbrook were stopped permanently. I thought about Tyler's face when he'd held that first hook he'd forged, the pride and wonder of creating something permanent. I thought about Elijah's words in his journal. "We endured. What we build with our hands, we defend with our hearts." The forge stood outside my window, solid and permanent in moonlight. 187 years it had stood. It would stand for 187 more, because I wasn't going to be the ironwood who broke that chain. Not for Victoria's aesthetic standards, not for Richard's shopping center, not for money or threats or violence. I had fought for my country in Afghanistan. Now I was fighting for my home in Tennessee. Different battlefield, same principles. Stand your ground. Protect what matters. Never surrender to bullies who think power and money make them untouchable. The war was far from over, but I was finally ready to fight it the way it needed to be fought. Not with fear and desperation, but with patience and planning, and the cold determination of someone who understood that some things are worth everything you have to give. 8 months from now, that determination would lead to bolt cutters screeching through a padlock, Sheriff Rodriguez crouched in darkness with handcuffs ready, and 3 idiots walking into the most documented crime scene in Grayson County history. But tonight, sitting at my kitchen table with broken glass crunching under my boots and deputies outside protecting me from the next attack, I was just a 61-year-old veteran learning that the war never really ends. You just choose which battles are worth fighting and which hills are worth dying on. The Ironwood Forge was my hill, and I'd fight for it until either Victoria surrendered or the courts made her. No retreat, no surrender. Just the long, patient work of building a case that would bury her ambitions in legal precedents and federal charges. The war had begun in earnest, and I was done playing defense. The phone call that changed everything came at 11:47 in the evening on a Tuesday, jolting me awake from dreams about bulldozers and legal briefs. My nephew Jake's voice crackled through the old landline, breathless with the kind of excitement that comes from discovering buried treasure or uncovering the truth that powerful people tried to hide. "Uncle Marcus, I found it. The smoking gun that blows Victoria's whole operation to pieces." I fumbled for my glasses and the kitchen light, my heart already racing even though I didn't yet know why. The numbers on the microwave glowed green in the darkness. Nearly midnight. Jake worked part-time at the county assessor's office while finishing his paralegal certification. The kid had been digging through filing cabinets like an archaeological expedition, and apparently he'd struck gold. Found what exactly? The original 1952 deed restriction for Grayson Hills Estates. There's a clause specifically protecting agricultural structures existing prior to residential development. But, Uncle Marcus, here's the nuclear bomb. Guess who personally signed the acknowledgement when the HOA was formed 3 years ago? The pause stretched like a bridge cable under load, and I already knew the answer before Jake spoke it. Harold Whitman, current HOA president. He knew about these protections and signed documents acknowledging they're legally binding. Every threatening letter, every fine, every enforcement action against your forge has violated deed restrictions that predated the Civil War. An hour later, Jake's folder hit my kitchen table with the weight of destiny. Page after page of photocopied documentation proving that the harassment campaign had been built on lies from day one. The coffee pot gurgled in the background, filling the house with the bitter smell of caffeine and approaching justice. The musty smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee as I absorbed the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. But the real revelation came buried on page 17, a legal definition I'd never heard before. Tortious interference with property rights. When someone knowingly violates established property protections for financial gain, they face triple damages plus mandatory attorney fees. In layman's terms, Victoria hadn't just been harassing me. She'd been committing federal crimes worth millions in potential penalties. The power dynamic didn't just shift in that moment, it inverted completely. For months, I'd been playing defense against HOA regulations that legally couldn't touch me. Now I held documentation proving they'd known these regulations were illegal from day one, and proceeded anyway. Jake spread additional documents across the table, paper rustling like leaves in a storm. Uncle Marcus, this gets bigger. I found 8 other properties with identical protections. The Hendersons' greenhouse, Mrs. Murphy's chicken coop, that old workshop behind the Martinez place. All protected by the same deed restrictions. All being targeted by the same tactics. The scope of the conspiracy crystallized like frost on morning windows. This wasn't about one stubborn property owner refusing to cooperate with reasonable community standards. This was a systematic scheme to circumvent historical preservation laws by pressuring protected families into voluntary compliance with regulations that had no legal authority whatsoever. Some people already caved, Jake continued, his voice carrying the weight of injustice witnessed. The Kowalski farm, the Peterson place. They demolished protected structures because they didn't know about their rights, didn't know the HOA was lying to them. County records revealed the pattern clearly. Properties with deed protections were being systematically targeted through manufactured violations and harassment campaigns. Once families sold or demolished their historically protected structures, developers could argue the entire area had evolved beyond preservation status. Clear the land of inconvenient history, then claim historical significance no longer applied. Here's what made my blood pressure spike into dangerous territory. Original deed restrictions don't just supersede HOA rules. They create constitutional protections that trigger federal oversight when violated. Property owners who prove coordinated harassment often receive not just monetary damages, but court orders dissolving offending boards and placing communities under federal monitoring. The transformation was complete. Instead of being a difficult neighbor fighting unreasonable rules, I was now a constitutional rights defender, with federal law backing my case, and documented proof of criminal conspiracy by elected officials. Wednesday morning's call to attorney Jimmy Castellano changed everything again. After reviewing Jake's documentation for 30 minutes, his assessment was devastating in its clarity. Mr. Ironwood, you don't have a property dispute. You have a federal civil rights violation worth potentially millions in damages. The files covering his conference table told a story that transcended neighborhood politics. This was about developers using HOA structures to circumvent constitutional protections, systematically targeting families with legally protected properties through coordinated campaigns that violated not just state law, but federal statutes designed to protect American heritage. But Jimmy's final revelation hit like lightning, striking twice in the same spot. Cross-referencing property records with development proposals revealed the ultimate truth. The parcels they've acquired through pressure tactics form a perfect corridor for shopping complex expansion. Your forge isn't just inconvenient, Marcus. It's the keystone preventing a multi-million-dollar development that's been in planning for 3 years. Driving home through afternoon shadows, I felt the weight of history settling on my shoulders, like my grandfather's old work coat. My forge hadn't just survived 2 centuries of weather and change, it had become ground zero in a battle between constitutional property rights and corporate manipulation, disguised as community governance. The taste of victory was still bitter with anticipation, cutting through the coffee and leaving something metallic on my tongue. But underneath that complexity was something pure and ancient. The flavor of justice finally within reach after months of being told I had no rights, no protections, no chance against people with money and lawyers and institutional power. Victoria Westbrook thought she was hunting a confused old man who didn't understand modern property law. She had no idea she'd just walked into the crosshairs of federal law enforcement and constitutional protections that had been waiting 200 years for exactly this fight. Thursday morning arrived with October air so crisp it made my sinuses tingle, and the kind of clarity that comes from finally seeing the whole chessboard instead of just the pieces trying to take your king. I called Sheriff Elena Rodriguez first, my coffee still steaming like a locomotive, while I spread Jake's documentation across the kitchen table like a general planning the invasion that would end this war. Sheriff, remember that harassment case we've been building? Turns out we've been hunting minnows when there's a whole shark swimming in these waters. Rodriguez arrived within an hour, her patrol car crunching up my gravel driveway with the authority of someone who'd seen enough neighborhood disputes to recognize when one had metastasized into federal crime. She examined Jake's findings with the methodical attention of a surgeon, occasionally whistling low through her teeth like she was discovering new species of criminal stupidity. Marcus, this stopped being harassment about 6 violations ago. We're looking at conspiracy to violate federal property rights. If we can prove coordination between the HOA development company and any local officials, we're talking RICO charges that carry 20-year sentences. The plan that emerged over 3 hours of coffee and strategy sessions was beautiful in its elegant simplicity. Let Victoria proceed with her threatened enforcement action, while we turned her illegal entry attempt into a federally documented crime scene. Multiple law enforcement witnesses, professional recording equipment, and enough legal firepower to transform her harassment campaign into a criminal prosecution that would make national headlines. The secret is making them think they're winning, Martinez explained, sketching surveillance positions on my property map like a football coach diagramming the perfect play. Let them commit every felony while we control the evidence collection. Every word recorded, every movement captured, every crime documented with the kind of precision that makes defense attorneys wake up screaming. Attorney Jimmy Castellano joined our war council that afternoon, his briefcase packed with legal precedents that read like a constitutional law professor's greatest hits collection. He'd taken my case pro bono because, as he put it with the predatory smile of someone who'd made corporate bullies cry in depositions, constitutional violations this blatant are career-making opportunities, and they need to be crushed so completely that other developers think twice before trying similar schemes in other communities. The legal strategy was 3-pronged and sharper than surgical steel. File federal civil rights complaints citing discriminatory enforcement patterns. Demand the HOA produce all communications with development interests under discovery rules that would expose every dirty detail of their conspiracy. Prepare countersuits for damages that would financially obliterate everyone involved in the scheme. Here's something most people don't know, Jimmy said, his pen scratching notes with the satisfaction of someone holding a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. Federal civil rights violations carry mandatory attorney fee awards to winners. Prove they violated your constitutional rights, and they pay for everything. Your legal costs, actual damages, and punitive awards that typically run into millions of dollars. But the most satisfying element was the trap we were choreographing with the precision of a military operation. Jimmy suggested allowing the HOA to proceed with their planned enforcement action, while Sheriff Rodriguez positioned deputies to witness the illegal entry with federal standard documentation that would survive any appellate scrutiny. The goal was simple and devastating. Catch Victoria and her hired muscle committing multiple felonies while body cameras captured every incriminating word in action. Turn their victory celebration into a perp walk that would be replayed on evening news broadcasts across the state. Rachel Torres mobilized our community resistance network with the efficiency of someone who'd organized half the town's charity drives and most of its successful political campaigns. 8 families discovered they possessed similar deed protections they'd never known existed. The local newspaper committed to an investigative series on development pressure tactics. the Historical Society launched a broader campaign for property rights awareness that was already attracting state-level attention and questions from legislators about HOA accountability. People need to understand recording laws, Jimmy warned during our strategy session, highlighting relevant statutes in his worn law books. In our state, single-party consent means you can record any conversation you participate in. But for maximum legal impact, we want everything documented by law enforcement with proper chain of custody that will survive federal court scrutiny and potential appeals all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. The technical preparation took on the precision of a NASA launch sequence. Rachel arranged professional-grade security cameras with crystal-clear audio from her hardware store connections. Sheriff Rodriguez coordinated with the county prosecutor's office for immediate warrant processing if criminal activity occurred. Jake prepared legal documentation for instant service the moment trespassing began. But the most crucial element was psychological warfare, and I'd learned that particular art form in 2 tours through Afghanistan. Victoria had scheduled her enforcement action for Tuesday morning, apparently believing midweek timing would minimize witnesses and community attention. She had no idea we'd transformed her stealth operation into a public demonstration of what happens when federal law enforcement protects constitutional rights against corporate greed. When private organizations conspire with commercial entities to violate property rights, Jimmy noted, highlighting relevant RICO statutes with yellow marker that made the pages look like legal warnings. Federal prosecutors get personally invested. These cases become career priorities because they involve fundamental constitutional protections that go to the heart of what it means to be American. The irony was so perfect, it tasted like aged bourbon burning all the way down. While Victoria planned a secret operation to steal my family's property and erase 200 years of history, we were preparing to document federal crimes with enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved and bankrupt their entire operation. Monday night, sitting in my grandfather's old chair, with springs that knew the shape of 4 generations of ironwood men, I felt the weight of history settling on my shoulders, like a familiar coat that fit perfectly despite its age. The forge stood silhouetted against moonlight, solid and defiant, ready to become ground zero in a battle that would determine whether constitutional property rights still meant anything in modern America, or if money and corporate power had finally won. The taste of anticipation mixed with black coffee and the smell of aged wood drifting through windows I'd left open to catch the autumn breeze. Tomorrow, Victoria Westbrook would learn the difference between bullying an isolated homeowner and attacking someone protected by federal law, constitutional rights, and a sheriff who'd read the Constitution more recently than she had. After our Federal War Council with its maps and recording equipment and legal strategies, Victoria went into full desperation mode with the tactical finesse of a rabid animal trapped in a corner with nowhere left to run. She called an emergency HOA board meeting for Sunday evening, accidentally on purpose, forgetting to invite known Marcus supporters like Rachel Torres and Mrs. Patterson, who'd been asking uncomfortable questions about financial transparency. The community center reeked of burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant, as she presented her case to a carefully curated audience of newer residents who'd swallowed her propaganda whole and hadn't lived here long enough to understand what they were destroying. The meeting minutes, which Rachel obtained through official channels the next morning using open records laws, read like a manifesto written by someone who'd watched too many legal thrillers and understood none of the actual law. The board voted to authorize immediate enforcement action against my forge, hire Alpine Security Services for compliance assistance, establish a $15,000 emergency fund for community legal protection. What the minutes didn't mention, because official records rarely document criminal conspiracy in plain language, was that Alpine Security was owned by Derek Westbrook's brother-in-law, transforming HOA funds into a family money laundering operation. But Victoria's real desperation showed Tuesday morning when a fake utility worker appeared at my door like a discount spy movie extra who'd failed the audition. Guy in coveralls claiming to be from the gas company, insisting he needed emergency access to check for dangerous leaks near my forge that threatened the entire neighborhood. The overpowering smell of cheap aftershave mixed with nervous sweat gave him away. Before I noticed, his utility truck had no company logos and license plates that didn't match the vehicle registration visible through his unwashed windshield. "I'll need to see your work order and company identification," I said calmly, my phone already recording every stuttered word and facial tic that screamed amateur criminal. He fumbled through empty pockets like a magician who'd forgotten his tricks, mumbled something about leaving paperwork in another truck, and drove away fast enough to leave rubber streaks on my gravel driveway that would photograph beautifully for the police report. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Rodriguez confirmed the gas company had no scheduled inspections in our area and no record of that license plate because it belonged to a 2015 Honda Civic registered to Derek Westbrook's cousin, not a work truck. The woman was apparently hiring the intellectual equivalent of discount criminals to conduct industrial espionage. Meanwhile, Victoria's social media campaign reached new heights of creative fiction that would have impressed professional propagandists. Posts appeared with the regularity of a Swiss watch, featuring heavily photoshopped images of my property that made the forge look like it was actively collapsing. Mysterious claims about environmental contamination supported by soil samples that couldn't have come from my land unless someone had trucked in contaminated dirt from somewhere else. Testimonials from neighbors I'd never met, describing imaginary incidents involving my structurally unsound death trap that somehow threatened property values and children's safety simultaneously. The comment sections are filled with sock puppet accounts, all sharing the same suspicious enthusiasm for property values and community safety, all using similar grammar errors and writing patterns that suggested one person managing multiple fake identities. Apparently, Derek had discovered copy and paste functionality, but not subtlety or the concept of varying his writing style. Thursday brought the nuclear option that told me just how desperate and dangerous the situation had become. Derek approached my former employer at the Ford plant with what he called serious character concerns about a potentially dangerous former employee. He was trying to destroy my reputation in the tight-knit machinist community, where word-of-mouth recommendations were everything and a bad reference could end careers. Unfortunately for him, my supervisor of 20 years knew exactly what kind of man I was, and exactly what kind of scam Derek was running. Dale, some pencil neck in an expensive suit, came asking about your mental stability and dangerous hoarding behavior, my old boss called to tell me, his voice carrying the kind of amusement reserved for watching idiots step on rakes repeatedly. I told him the only thing you ever hoarded was overtime hours and the respect of everyone who worked with you. Then I asked him to leave before I called security and had him escorted out like the trash he was. But the real escalation arrived Thursday afternoon in the form of a legal threat that made previous communications look like birthday party invitations. The HOA's attorney had crafted a masterpiece of manufactured urgency, claiming my forge violated 17 different safety codes, posed imminent and substantial danger to neighborhood children who might wander onto the property, and constituted an environmental hazard requiring immediate professional remediation by licensed contractors at my expense. They demanded voluntary demolition within 48 hours, or the HOA would proceed with all available legal remedies, including forced destruction, property liens that could lead to foreclosure, and potential criminal charges for maintaining a public nuisance. The certified mail sticker was still warm when I called Jimmy Castellano, and his reaction after reading the threats was like watching a great white shark smell blood in the water. "Marcus, they just handed us a federal prosecution on a silver platter," he said with barely contained glee, threatening foreclosure based on fabricated violations, claiming authority they legally don't possess, demanding property destruction while knowing about constitutional protections. This letter violates about 6 federal statutes simultaneously. I'm actually impressed by their incompetence. Here's something most homeowners never learn until it's too late. And by then the damage is done and their property is gone. Always demand written documentation for every HOA enforcement action, because most shortcuts they take are illegal. And illegal enforcement can void their entire authority over your property and subject them to criminal prosecution. While Victoria's public campaign reached fever pitch with daily social media posts and neighborhood meetings to discuss the Marcus Ironwood problem, we maintained complete radio silence about our federal documentation and law enforcement coordination. To outside observers, I appeared increasingly isolated and desperate, exactly the vulnerable image we wanted to project while preparing the legal equivalent of a nuclear strike. Sheriff Rodriguez's review of HOA documentation revealed violations that transformed their enforcement threats from civil annoyances into criminal prosecutions, carrying serious prison time. Private security companies cannot legally enter property without court orders or owner permission. HOA liens require due process procedures they'd completely ignored. Threatening foreclosure based on knowingly fabricated violations constitutes criminal fraud with mandatory minimum sentences. But the most revealing escalation came Friday evening when a black sedan with tinted windows that screamed unmarked surveillance vehicle parked across from my driveway and remained there for 3 hours like a discount spy team that had learned everything about surveillance from watching bad movies. When Martinez ran the plates, the vehicle traced to a rental company with cash payment and identification, so fake it wouldn't fool a convenience store clerk checking IDs for cigarette sales. Saturday night, staring through my kitchen window at the forge that had survived 2 centuries of genuine challenges from weather and war and economic collapse, I tasted the metallic anticipation of approaching justice on my tongue. Victoria had escalated from harassment into criminal intimidation, but she had no idea that every desperate measure was being documented by federal standards and building toward a reckoning that would expose her entire criminal enterprise to daylight and consequences. The trap was set with the precision of a Swiss watch. The bait had been taken like a starving fish hitting a lure, and Tuesday morning would bring the reckoning she'd been begging for with every illegal action and every arrogant assumption that money and connections made her untouchable. Monday morning brought Victoria's final gambit, with all the subtlety of a freight train crashing through a library during quiet hours. She posted official-looking notices throughout the neighborhood, announcing my forge would be secured for mandatory safety inspection within 24 hours, complete with fake letterhead designed to look like county documents, and language suggesting she possessed emergency powers granted by some imaginary authority. The notices even included a hotline for concerned residents to report additional violations, a number that, when Rachel called it out of morbid curiosity, went straight to Derek's personal cell phone. The woman wasn't even trying to hide the conspiracy anymore. She'd become so confident in her power and so convinced of my helplessness that she'd stopped bothering with plausible deniability. The enforcement team she'd assembled belonged in a comedy show about incompetent criminals trying to rob a police station. Tommy Morrison, Derek's brother-in-law, apparently believed that carrying bolt cutters and wearing an Alpine Security polo shirt granted him federal authority to break into private property. His 2 associates had the combined IQ of a bag of wet cement and about as much legal knowledge as a goldfish has about quantum physics. But Monday afternoon brought Victoria's most desperate play yet. A briefcase carrying representative from Summit Ridge Development, who smiled like a used car salesman selling flood-damaged vehicles to hurricane victims, showed up at my door with an offer that was supposed to sound generous but reeked of desperation. "Mr. Ironwood, I'm authorized to offer 150% of your property's assessed value for immediate sale," he announced, opening his briefcase like he was revealing the crown jewels of England. "All legal problems disappear instantly. All HOA disputes vanish like morning fog. You walk away with enough money to buy something much nicer in a more appropriate community where people understand modern standards." The racial undertones weren't subtle, but the implied threats were crystal clear and probably actionable under fair housing laws. When I politely declined his generous offer with language that suggested he could take his briefcase and shove it somewhere anatomically improbable, his demeanor shifted from friendly salesman to something that belonged in a back alley mugging. "That's unfortunate," he said, snapping his briefcase shut with the finality of a coffin lid closing on someone buried alive. "Property disputes can become quite complicated, Mr. Ironwood. Complications have a way of affecting people's financial situations, their reputations, even their safety in unexpected ways. Accidents happen. Houses catch fire. People get hurt. It would be tragic if something happened to you or your family." After he left trailing threats that were probably felonies in 12 states, the bitter taste of anger mixed with black coffee created a combination strong enough to dissolve steel. These people weren't just stealing property through legal manipulation. They were making direct threats against my physical safety and implicitly threatening my family. They'd crossed every line between civil disputes and criminal intimidation, and they were too arrogant to realize they were building their own prison cells one threat at a time. But here's where their psychological warfare revealed a fatal flaw that Sun Tzu would have recognized immediately. They assumed I was fighting this battle alone and defenseless, just another old man who'd fold under enough pressure. While they orchestrated their intimidation campaign with threatening letters and fake inspectors and implied violence, our federal response team was positioning for a counterattack that would transform their enforcement action into a criminal prosecution that would make legal history and change HOA law across the country. Sheriff Rodriguez had positioned unmarked surveillance vehicles with perfect sightlines to the forge, coordinated with the prosecutor's office for immediate warrant processing the moment crimes occurred, and arranged for federal-grade recording equipment that would capture every syllable of their illegal entry attempt in high definition with timestamp authentication that would be admissible in any court in America. The irony was beautiful enough to make grown men weep. While Victoria planned a stealth operation to illegally enter my property and begin demolition, we'd turned her crime scene into a federally monitored demonstration of constitutional justice, with more cameras than a Hollywood movie production. Meanwhile, her smear campaign reached levels of desperate creativity that would have impressed fiction writers if it wasn't so pathetically transparent. Anonymous flyers appeared throughout the neighborhood, claiming my forge contained asbestos, lead paint, radioactive materials left over from some imaginary World War II project, and unspecified biological hazards that threatened the entire county's groundwater supply. Social media posts suggested I was threatening children who played near the property, harboring criminal activity in the forge's hidden spaces, operating an environmental disaster that required immediate federal intervention before someone died from my negligence. The fake testimonials were particularly entertaining in their absurdity. According to Victoria's propaganda machine, my forge had caused mysterious respiratory illnesses in people who'd never set foot on my property, attracted packs of dangerous wildlife that didn't exist in Tennessee, and created traffic hazards that threatened emergency vehicle access despite being located on a dead-end road. If half these claims were accurate, the CDC would have quarantined my property, and the National Guard would be conducting evacuations in hazmat suits. Instead, county health inspectors had been out 4 times and found nothing wrong except Victoria Westbrook's relationship with reality. But Monday evening brought the moment we'd been choreographing for weeks. Derek personally delivered what he called the final enforcement notice, while standing directly in front of security cameras that recorded every incriminating word in high definition, with audio quality that would make the trial prosecutor's job almost too easy. "This is your last chance, Thornfield. Tomorrow morning at dawn, we're taking possession of that structure for public safety reasons. You can cooperate, and maybe we'll discuss reasonable compensation for your trouble. Or you can resist and face the full legal consequences of obstructing legitimate community enforcement actions authorized by law." Perfect. Derek had just provided federal quality recording of conspiracy to commit criminal trespass, theft of property, and violation of constitutional rights. Sometimes criminals are their own worst enemies, building their own cases one arrogant word at a time. That night, surrounded by my grandfather's tools and the smell of aged wood mixing with machine oil and 2 centuries of honest work, I felt the weight of American history preparing to witness justice finally arriving after months of being told I had no rights and no recourse. Every hammer hanging on those walls, every saw, every plane that had built something permanent and meaningful would watch constitutional protections prove stronger than corporate greed and neighborhood tyranny. Tuesday morning would bring 3 idiots with bolt cutters, expecting to find a defeated homeowner ready to surrender his family's legacy to save himself from bankruptcy and harassment. Instead, they'd walk into Sheriff Rodriguez's carefully orchestrated federal crime scene with body cameras rolling, and enough legal firepower to prosecute everyone involved for violations carrying serious prison time and financial penalties that would bankrupt their entire criminal enterprise. The taste of approaching vindication was sweeter than any victory and more satisfying than any revenge my small mind could have imagined. Constitutional rights were about to remind some very stupid people why they're called constitutional rights, why they're protected by federal law, why they matter more than money or power or connections. I sat in my grandfather's chair, running my fingers over the armrests worn smooth by generations of ironwood men contemplating the weight of difficult decisions. Outside, the forge stood in moonlight, solid and permanent and ready. Inside, I felt something I hadn't felt since Afghanistan. That cold clarity that comes before combat. That certainty that you're on the right side of history and the right side of the law. And tomorrow the universe will balance its scales. The war was ending, justice was arriving. And Victoria Westbrook's small mind had no idea how completely she'd lost this fight before the final battle even began. 6:42 in the morning. The bolt cutters screeched through my family's 187-year-old padlock like a metal banshee announcing Judgment Day. That sound should have broken my heart into pieces small enough to scatter in the wind. Instead, it was the sweetest symphony I'd heard since the day my daughter Jennifer was born 32 years ago, in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and new beginnings, because I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of those forged doors. Sheriff Elena Rodriguez crouched in the shadows behind oak beams that had witnessed the Underground Railroad and 2 world wars, her body camera recording every felony second in high definition that would play beautifully in federal court. Her radio was live, connecting her to 6 backup units positioned in a perimeter that made my property more secure than Fort Knox. Her handcuffs were ready, standard-issue steel that would look perfect on wrists accustomed to expensive watches and assumption of immunity. Steam fogged my kitchen window where I stood with coffee growing cold in my grip, that had forgotten how to release its death hold on the ceramic mug. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation of justice finally arriving after 8 months of harassment that had pushed me to edges I didn't know I possessed. The morning air carried smells that would stay with me forever. Dew on ancient wood, the sharp metallic bite of cut steel, the approaching scent of constitutional reckoning that smelled like cold autumn morning and hot coffee, and something indefinable that tasted like vindication. 3 men in Property Enforcement Solutions polo shirts moved through pre-dawn fog like shadows, who thought they were invisible, their bolt cutters making obscene sounds as they destroyed a lock that had protected freedom seekers and honest work for longer than their combined ages. Tommy Morrison led them, Derek Westbrook's brother-in-law, a man who apparently believed wearing a security company uniform granted him authority to commit federal crimes. What they couldn't see through those barn doors, what their small minds couldn't comprehend in their arrogance, was that they just walked into the most thoroughly documented trap in Grayson County history. Every word they spoke would be recorded with FBI-grade equipment, every movement captured from 4 different camera angles, every crime documented with the kind of precision that makes defense attorneys wake up screaming and prosecutors smile in their sleep. Entry achieved, Tommy announced into his walkie-talkie with the professional authority of someone whose legal education came from reality television and action movies. Beginning interior compliance assessment per contract specifications. 30 seconds later, the sound echoing from that historic forge wasn't hammering or sawing or demolition equipment. It was pure, undiluted panic. 3 grown men realizing simultaneously that they'd just committed breaking and entering in front of a county sheriff who'd been documenting their every criminal move with equipment that would make their convictions inevitable. County Sheriff Rodriguez's voice cut through the morning air with the authority of federal law and righteous anger combined. You're under arrest for breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, conspiracy to commit theft, and violation of constitutional property rights. Hands where I can see them. Now. The scrambling sounds that followed were music to my ears, boots on old floorboards as they tried to process what was happening. The confusion in their voices, as tiny brains struggled to comprehend that the trap had already sprung, and they were caught like rats in a mechanism designed with 8 months of careful planning. The beautiful sound of criminal stupidity meeting constitutional reality, in the form of a sheriff who'd read the Constitution more recently than they'd read anything requiring more than a 5th-grade education. What the hell? Tommy's voice cracked like a pubescent teenager facing his first real consequences. We have legal authorization. The HOA contracted us for legitimate property enforcement. Authorization from who? Rodriguez responded with the calm of mountain granite and twice the immovability. Because the HOA doesn't have constitutional authority to violate federal property protections. You just committed multiple felonies while a sheriff's body camera documented every illegal action. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. I watched from my kitchen window as Rodriguez emerged from the forge with three handcuffed men stumbling ahead of her like prisoners of war who'd surrendered without firing a shot. Backup units rolled in with lights flashing, transforming my quiet property into a crime scene that would be documented in police reports and legal filings, and eventually law school textbooks about what happens when constitutional rights meet professional law enforcement. That's when Victoria Westbrook's white Mercedes came screaming into my driveway like she was racing to catch a flight she couldn't afford to miss, expecting to supervise her triumphant property seizure, and probably planning to take selfies in front of my forge before ordering its demolition. Instead, she found her enforcement team in federal custody. Sheriff Rodriguez reading Miranda rights in a voice that carried across the morning air like a church bell announcing services, and me stepping onto my porch with a folder thick enough to serve as evidence in a federal RICO prosecution. "What is the meaning of this travesty?" Victoria shrieked, erupting from her Mercedes in full corporate battle armor. Power suit that probably cost more than my truck. Heels too expensive for gravel. Leather portfolio clutched like it contained nuclear launch codes instead of manufactured violations, and lies written by lawyers who'd sold their souls for retainer fees. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, approaching Victoria with the methodical pace of justice that had been building momentum for 8 months of documented crimes. "You're under arrest for criminal conspiracy, systematic harassment, violation of federal civil rights, and about 6 other charges that will be formally filed within the hour." The look on Victoria's face in that moment was worth every sleepless night I'd spent researching property law and building this case brick by legal brick. Shock that someone had dared to challenge her authority. Rage that her carefully orchestrated plan had collapsed into federal prosecution. Dawning horror as she realized her harassment campaign had just transformed into criminal charges, carrying serious prison time and financial penalties that would bankrupt her family's development company. "This is absolutely ridiculous!" Victoria screamed as handcuffs clicked around wrists accustomed to expensive jewelry and steering wheels that cost more than most people's cars. "We have every legal right to enforce community standards. The HOA covenant clearly states our authority to maintain property values and aesthetic harmony." That's when I delivered the line I'd been rehearsing in my head for 3 months. The words that would play on local news broadcasts and eventually get quoted in legal journals about property rights and constitutional protections. "Victoria, you had the right to remain silent. Too bad you never had the intelligence to use it. Sheriff Rodriguez and federal investigators have been documenting your criminal conspiracy since day one. You didn't just break into my forge, you broke into a federal crime scene. You didn't just violate HOA rules, you violated constitutional protections that have existed since before your great-grandmother was born." The color drained from her face like someone had pulled a plug, leaving her looking like a deflated balloon at a child's birthday party that had ended hours ago. The woman who terrorized half the neighborhood with threats and intimidation and manufactured violations was finally seeing what happens when constitutional rights meet professional law enforcement and 8 months of meticulous documentation. Attorney Jimmy Castellano arrived with a convoy of legal firepower that included restraining orders, federal civil rights complaints, and enough documentation to prosecute everyone involved in the conspiracy, from the hired thugs to the HOA board to the development company executives who'd orchestrated this entire scheme. Local news crews were already setting up cameras as social media spread word about the arrests faster than wildfire in drought conditions. "This case represents systematic violation of constitutional property rights for commercial gain," Jimmy announced to gathering reporters and cameras that would broadcast this moment across Tennessee and eventually across the country as a landmark case about HOA abuse. "Federal prosecutors will pursue charges that carry significant prison time and financial penalties that will serve as warning to other developers who think they can circumvent constitutional protections through harassment and intimidation." Derek Westbrook tried fleeing in his BMW, apparently believing he could escape consequences by simply driving away from a crime scene surrounded by law enforcement. He found his route blocked by patrol cars and a crowd of neighbors who'd finally had enough of the Westbrook family's reign of terror over their community. His face when Rodriguez approached his car with handcuffs ready was almost as satisfying as Victoria's had been. For 8 months, I'd stood in my driveway, surrounded by the smell of morning coffee and the sound of handcuffs clicking, feeling 2 centuries of American property rights vindicated in the most public and permanent way possible. My grandfather's forge had survived slavery and civil war, world wars, and economic depression. And now it had defeated suburban tyranny with constitutional law and federal justice and the kind of documentation that makes criminals wish they'd chosen different careers. The hunter had become the hunted, the powerful had become prisoners, and justice had finally come home to Grayson County with body cameras and handcuffs and charges that would echo through legal history. But even in victory, standing on my porch, watching Victoria and Derek being loaded into patrol cars while neighbors gathered to witness the fall of tyrants, I felt something unexpected mixing with the satisfaction. Not pity exactly, but recognition that these were human beings who'd made terrible choices and would now face terrible consequences. The line between justice and revenge is thinner than most people want to admit, and I'd walked that line for 8 months without falling into the darkness that would have made me know better than them. 6 months later, the legal dust had settled like fresh snow on a peaceful winter morning, and the results exceeded even Jimmy Castellanos' most optimistic predictions delivered over bourbon in his cluttered office. Victoria Westbrook pleaded guilty to federal harassment charges rather than face trial that would have exposed even more criminal behavior. She paid $47,000 in fines, restitution, and legal fees. Turns out, systematically violating constitutional rights carries a price tag steeper than luxury car payments and designer wardrobe budgets combined. Derek's development company, Summit Ridge, settled the civil rights lawsuit for an amount Jimmy described with predatory satisfaction as enough to endow a small college scholarship fund. $600,000 that would be split between restoring my forge, funding legal defense for other harassment victims, and establishing protections to prevent future Victoria Westbrooks from destroying what communities had spent generations building. The HOA board dissolved faster than cheap instant coffee and hot water, replaced by community-elected representatives who actually read constitutional law before making decisions that affected people's lives and property. Harold Whitman resigned in disgrace after FBI investigators discovered his signed acknowledgments of deed protections, proving he'd knowingly participated in criminal conspiracy to circumvent laws he'd sworn to uphold. The new board's first official act was issuing a formal apology to me and 8 other families who'd been targeted by the systematic harassment campaign. They established a property rights protection fund for future legal challenges and rewrote the HOA covenant to explicitly acknowledge historical protections and constitutional limitations on their authority. But the most satisfying outcome was what happened to my grandfather's forge. The state fast-tracked its historical designation, officially recognizing its Underground Railroad heritage and protecting it under federal preservation laws that made future interference impossible without violating statutes that carried prison sentences and penalties even wealthy developers couldn't afford. The bronze plaque mounted beside the massive oak doors that had witnessed 2 centuries of American history read words that made my throat tight every time I saw them. Ironwood Station, 1837. Protected site of American freedom. Running my fingers across those raised letters still gave me chills every morning when I unlocked the workshop where my grandfather had taught me that some things matter more than money or comfort or safety. That forge became something my grandfather Samuel could never have imagined, but Elijah would have understood perfectly. The beating heart of a thriving community center that offered free vocational training, veterans therapy programs, and historical education that taught young people their heritage was worth fighting for. The Ironwood Community Heritage Center offered free woodworking and metalworking classes for neighborhood kids who'd grown up thinking history was boring and irrelevant. Veterans dealing with PTSD found healing through the rhythm of hammer on anvil and the satisfaction of creating something permanent with hands that remembered too much violence. Anyone wanting to learn the satisfaction of building something that would outlast them found teachers who understood that craftsmanship was more than technique. It was connection to everyone who'd come before and everyone who'd come after. The rich smell of pine shavings mingled with coal smoke and coffee from our volunteer-run cafe, creating an atmosphere of creativity and healing that drew visitors from 3 counties and eventually from across the state as word spread about what had been built from the ashes of attempted destruction. Rachel Torres expanded beyond nursing into community organizing, using our victory as template for helping other families defend their property rights against HOA overreach and corporate pressure. She became the go-to expert for constitutional property protections, her phone ringing constantly with calls from people who'd received threatening letters and needed someone who understood the law, actually protected them, more than it protected their harassers. My health improved dramatically once the metallic taste of constant stress was replaced by sweeter flavors of community coffee and shared purpose. The tension headaches that had plagued me for 8 months disappeared like morning fog and sunshine. My sleep returned to something approaching normal for a 62-year-old man with combat memories and grief that never fully heals. My blood pressure dropped to levels that made my doctor ask what miracle cure I'd discovered, and I told him the truth. Constitutional justice is better medicine than anything you can prescribe. Jake left his county assessor job to work full-time as property rights paralegal, helping other families discover legal protections they never knew existed. The kid had a gift for translating complex deed language into plain English that normal people could understand and use to defend themselves. His client success rate would make big city attorneys jealous, and he did it for fees that were affordable instead of bankrupting. The settlement money funded something that would outlast all of us: the Heritage Property Protection Scholarship for law students specializing in constitutional rights. Jimmy Castellano established the program at the State University, providing free legal assistance to homeowners facing similar pressure from developers and HOA tyrants who thought money and corporate lawyers made them invincible. So far, the program had protected 63 historic properties and bankrupted 9 corrupt development schemes across Tennessee. Apparently, our case study had become required reading in constitutional law classes, teaching future lawyers that some fights are worth having because they protect principles larger than individual victories. But the ripple effects extended far beyond legal victories and protected properties. The Historical Society received a federal grant for property rights education, creating traveling exhibits that taught Americans about deed protections and constitutional safeguards most people never discover until it's too late, and their heritage has been bulldozed for parking lots and strip malls. The Veterans Administration adopted our case as a model for helping military families defend inherited property against bureaucratic harassment and corporate manipulation. Turned out a lot of veterans came home from war to find developers circling their family land like vultures waiting for weakness and opportunity. Sheriff Elena Rodriguez was promoted to chief deputy after federal prosecutors praised her investigation as textbook example of protecting constitutional rights through professional law enforcement that documented crimes with precision that made convictions inevitable. She still stopped by the workshop for coffee and to share war stories about other HOA cases she was investigating. Apparently, our victory had inspired other harassment victims to start fighting back instead of surrendering to pressure that looked overwhelming until someone showed them the law was actually on their side. The annual Property Rights Day celebration became our community's signature event, drawing families from across the state to learn about constitutional protections while enjoying live bluegrass music, historical demonstrations, and barbecue that made people forget their troubles long enough to remember what community actually meant. Children who'd once been taught to fear my dangerous barn now competed to show their parents the birdhouses and toolboxes they'd crafted in weekend classes that taught them patience and precision and pride in work done with their own hands. Even some of Victoria's former supporters approached me with sheepish apologies after learning about the criminal conspiracy they'd unknowingly supported through silence and assumptions that nice people in expensive suits must be telling the truth. Fear and misinformation are powerful weapons in the wrong hands. But truth and constitutional law prove stronger every single time when people have courage to stand up and fight back. Several families discovered they'd been pressured into unnecessary property modifications by the same illegal tactics used against me. Chain link fences replaced with expensive privacy fencing, sheds demolished because they were supposedly violations, gardens destroyed because someone decided uniformity mattered more than individual expression. All based on HOA authority that legally didn't exist but was enforced through intimidation and manufactured fear. The most meaningful transformation happened to the forge itself, to the building that had started this entire fight. Those thick walls that once sheltered families escaping slavery now protected a different kind of freedom. The liberty that comes from understanding your rights and having the courage to defend them against people who think money and position make them immune to consequences. Every time I walked through those massive oak doors, I heard echoes of my grandfather's hammer mixing with children's laughter as they learned that building something permanent requires both skill and determination, and willingness to defend what matters against those who think everything is for sale if the price is high enough. Last month, a PBS documentary crew spent a week filming our workshop for a series about Americans defending constitutional rights against modern tyranny, disguised as bureaucracy and community standards. The producer said our story captured something essential about the American spirit that too many people had forgotten. Ordinary people using law, community, and stubborn persistence to protect what matters most across generations. But the real victory wasn't measured in legal settlements or media attention, or even in the 63 other properties we'd helped save from similar schemes. The real victory was in young veterans who found peace working with their hands after years of war that left scars invisible to everyone except themselves. In neighbors who discovered their own historical protections and fought their own battles with tools we'd given them. In children learning that building something beautiful takes time and patience and respect for those who came before us and those who'll come after. As I stood in that forge on a winter morning 6 months after the arrests, watching steam rise from my coffee while teenagers learned to shape hot metal under Tyler's patient instruction, the smell of coal smoke and fresh sawdust mixed with something that smelled like hope and felt like purpose. The taste of victory had mellowed into something richer and more complex than simple satisfaction at watching enemies defeated. This was the satisfaction of knowing constitutional rights still mean something when defended by people who refuse to be intimidated by corporate bullies or neighborhood tyrants who mistake HOA positions for actual authority. The battle for my barn had saved more than one family's legacy. It had proved that American property rights, properly defended with law and community and stubborn refusal to surrender what generations built with their own hands, are stronger than any development scheme or conspiracy or attempt to erase history, because it doesn't fit someone's vision of aesthetic harmony and property values. The evening after the documentary crew finished filming, I sat alone in the forge after everyone had gone home to families and lives beyond these walls. The building was quiet, except for wind through high windows, and the settling sounds of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. It had weathered for nearly 2 centuries. I pulled out Elijah's journal, the leather worn smooth by generations of ironwood hands, seeking wisdom from a man who'd risked everything to protect strangers fleeing slavery. I read again the entry from March 1862. The night men came with dogs and torches seeking the family he'd hidden beneath these floorboards. We endured, Elijah had written in ink that had faded but never disappeared. What we build with our hands, we defend with our hearts. The forge is not iron and stone, it is freedom made real. I understood those words now in ways I couldn't have understood 8 months ago, when Victoria Westbrook first arrived with her violation notices and manufactured authority. The forge had always been more than a building. It was a promise made by one generation to the next. A promise that some things matter more than money or convenience or fitting in with people who measure worth by property values and aesthetic standards. Elijah had kept that promise by hiding freedom seekers when the world tried to kill them. Samuel had kept it by maintaining the forge through depression and wars, and decades when easier paths would have been to sell and walk away. And I'd kept it by refusing to surrender to harassment and intimidation, and threats that tried to break me through fear and isolation and financial pressure. But the real promise wasn't about preserving a building. It was about preserving the principle that ordinary people have rights that money and power can't override. That history matters not because it's old, but because it connects us to everyone who fought and built and endured before us. That community is stronger than intimidation when people stop being afraid and start standing together. Tyler found me sitting in the darkness with Elijah's journal open in my lap and tears running down my face that I didn't bother wiping away. "Grandpa," he said quietly, sitting beside me on the old bench Samuel had built from oak beams, salvaged when the roof was replaced 40 years ago. "Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," I told him honestly. "I'm grateful for this place, for family, for people like Jimmy and Elena and Rachel who fought beside me, for constitutional rights that still mean something when people have courage to defend them." Tyler leaned against me, and we sat in comfortable silence, broken only by wind and settling wood and the distant sound of traffic on roads that hadn't existed when Elijah built these walls. After a while, Tyler spoke again, his voice carrying the kind of wisdom that sometimes comes from children who see the world more clearly than adults who've learned to make excuses for injustice. "Grandpa, when I grow up, I want to fight for what's right too. Like you did, like Elijah did." I pulled him close. This boy who'd started this whole fight by asking why the forge mattered, and then showing me the answer through eyes that still believed one person could make a difference. "Then we'll teach you everything you need to know. Not just blacksmithing, but how to stand up when bullies try to push you down, how to use the law to protect what matters, how to build communities that defend each other instead of tearing each other apart for property values and aesthetic harmony." The wind picked up outside, rattling high windows that had witnessed more history than most museums. Somewhere in the darkness beyond these walls, Victoria Westbrook was probably sitting in a house she couldn't afford anymore, contemplating the ruins of ambitions that had crashed into constitutional reality. Derek was probably meeting with bankruptcy attorneys, watching his development empire collapse under weight of legal judgments and restitution payments that would follow him for decades. I didn't feel sorry for them. They'd made choices that hurt people, destroyed families, erased history for profit margins in shopping center developments that would be abandoned and forgotten within 20 years. They'd face consequences that were just and proportional to the harm they'd caused. But I also didn't feel the vindictive satisfaction I'd expected when imagining this moment during the darkest days of harassment and threats. I felt something quieter and more profound. The peace that comes from knowing you fought for something larger than personal victory, from knowing your fight protected others and established precedents that would protect future generations from similar schemes. The forge stood around us, solid and permanent and protected now by federal law that would outlast everyone involved in this fight. The walls that had sheltered freedom seekers now sheltered something equally precious: the idea that ordinary Americans still have power when they understand their rights and have courage to defend them against people who think money and position make them immune to consequences and constitutional limitations. As Tyler and I locked up the forge that evening and walked back to the farmhouse under stars that had watched ironwood men work this land for nearly 200 years, I thought about what comes next. Not for me, but for this place, for the principles we defended, for the community we'd built from the ashes of attempted destruction. The forge would stand for another 200 years if I had anything to say about it. Protected by law, sustained by community, defended by people who understood that some things transcend property values and aesthetic standards and HOA covenants, written by lawyers who'd never built anything permanent with their own hands. And when I was gone, when Tyler was my age teaching his own grandchildren the lessons Elijah had taught through journal entries, and Samuel had taught through patient demonstration, and I had taught through stubborn refusal to surrender what mattered, the forge would still be here, still teaching, still protecting, still reminding everyone who entered its doors that freedom is something you build with your hands and defend with your heart, and pass to the next generation, like a torch that must never be allowed to go out. That night, I slept better than I had in 8 months, in a bed that no longer felt empty because I'd filled my life with purpose larger than grief. The coffee would taste better tomorrow. The forge would smell like possibility instead of besieged history. And somewhere in the darkness, constitutional rights were still protecting ordinary Americans who refused to be intimidated by extraordinary pressure from people who'd forgotten that some principles are worth defending no matter the cost. The war was over. Justice had won, and the Ironwood Forge stood exactly where it had stood for 187 years, ready to stand for 187 more, protected by law and sustained by community, and defended by people who understood that some fights, some principles, some pieces of history are worth everything you have to give. 5 years passed like water flowing over ancient stones, wearing away the sharp edges of trauma, while leaving the core of what happened permanently changed and somehow stronger for the weathering. The forge still stood where it had stood for 192 years, but now it breathed with life that would have made Elijah smile and Samuel nod with quiet satisfaction. I stood in the doorway on a September morning that smelled like wood smoke and possibility, watching Tyler teach a class of 15 teenagers the basics of metalwork that their great-grandfathers would have known by heart. But their generation had to relearn in a world that had forgotten the satisfaction of building permanent things with temporary hands. He was 17 now, tall and strong with hands that already showed calluses in the same places mine did, in the same places Samuel's had, in the same places Elijah's must have 2 centuries ago. The rhythmic sound of hammer on anvil filled the space like a heartbeat. 15 kids working in coordination that would have seemed impossible when they'd first arrived 6 months ago, with attention spans measured in seconds, an assumption that history was something dead people did. Now they moved with purpose and focus that came from understanding they were creating something that would outlast them. Something that mattered in ways their phones and social media and temporary entertainments never could. Mr. Ironwood, a girl named Maria, approached me with a horseshoe she'd just finished, her face glowing with pride that made the burn on her thumb from careless contact with hot metal worth every second of pain. Is this good enough? I examined her work with the same critical eye Samuel had used examining mine 40 years ago. The horseshoe was rough, the curves not quite even, the nail holes slightly off-center. It was also honest work done with full attention and growing skill. It was perfect in its imperfection, beautiful in its proof that human hands had shaped it. It's better than my first one, I told her truthfully. Keep it. Remember that you made something real today, something that will still exist when everything digital has vanished into outdated technology and forgotten passwords. She clutched that horseshoe like it was made of gold instead of iron. And I saw in her face what Tyler had shown me 5 years ago when he'd first picked up a hammer in this same space. The recognition that she was part of something larger than herself, connected to everyone who'd ever shaped metal, and everyone who ever would. Tyler caught my eye across the forge, and something passed between us that didn't need words. Pride, gratitude, understanding that we were keeping promises made by men who'd been dead for decades or centuries, but whose legacy lived in every hammer strike, every shaped piece of metal, every young person learning that their hands could create permanence in a temporary world. After the class ended and the teenagers departed with their projects and new calluses and stories to tell families who wouldn't quite understand why their kids smelled like coal smoke and couldn't stop talking about blacksmithing, Tyler and I sat on the bench outside the forge doors, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm while we worked. I got my acceptance letter, he said quietly. MIT, full scholarship. Engineering program starts next fall. My chest tightened with emotions too complex to name. Pride that this boy had earned one of the most prestigious scholarships in the country. Fear that he'd leave and never come back to a forge that suddenly felt empty without his presence. Hope that he'd build a life bigger than anything Grayson County could offer. Grief that I was getting older and time was running faster than I'd realized. That's incredible, Tyler. Your mother must be thrilled. She is. He paused, staring at his coffee like it held answers to questions he hadn't quite figured out how to ask. But Grandpa, I've been thinking, what happens to this place when I'm gone? You can't run it alone. You're 67 years old. 68 in November, I corrected with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. But who's counting? I'm serious. You've built something here that matters. The classes, the veterans program, the historical preservation work. It's bigger than one person now. It needs structure, sustainability, a real plan for the future. He was right, of course. The forge had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd first fought Victoria Westbrook for the right to keep it standing. We served 300 people a year now, teenagers learning vocational skills, veterans finding healing through craftsmanship, families discovering their own histories through our oral history project, lawyers and activists using our legal precedent to fight HOA abuse across the state. But I was 67 years old with a bad knee and PTSD that still flared up when triggered by unexpected sounds or certain smells that brought me back to Afghanistan. I couldn't maintain this pace forever. Eventually, probably sooner than I wanted to admit, I'd need to step back and let younger hands take over the work. I've been talking to Rachel and Jimmy, Tyler continued. They think we should establish a nonprofit foundation. Board of directors, professional staff, fundraising infrastructure. Turn the forge into something that outlasts all of us. The idea made sense in ways that made my throat tight. This was what Elijah had wanted when he'd written those words in his journal 2 centuries ago. Not just a building that survived, but a living legacy that continued serving whatever freedom meant in each generation. For Elijah, it had meant hiding slaves fleeing to freedom. For Samuel, it had meant providing equipment and purpose through depression and war. For me, it had meant defending constitutional rights against corporate power. For Tyler's generation, it would mean something else, something we couldn't predict but could enable through proper structure and sustainable foundation. Let's do it, I said, but on one condition. You have to be on the board, even from MIT, even if you never come back except for holidays and summer breaks. This place needs your voice. Tyler's eyes welled up, and he looked away quickly, trying to hide emotion that men his age thought they should suppress. I'll always come back, Grandpa. This place is part of me now. You made sure of that. We sat in silence that felt like connection instead of emptiness, watching afternoon sun paint the forge walls in gold that made the old oak beams glow like they were lit from within by all the history they'd witnessed and protected. 6 months later, on a March morning that matched the temperature when Elijah had written his most famous journal entry in 1862, we held the official incorporation ceremony for the Ironwood Heritage Foundation. 200 people gathered in a tent beside the forge because the building itself couldn't hold everyone who wanted to witness this moment. Jimmy Castellano, now 77 and using a cane but still sharp as a tack and twice as dangerous to anyone who underestimated him, presided over the ceremony with Rachel Torres at his side. She'd taken on the role of executive director, leaving her nursing career to run the foundation full-time with salary funded by endowment we'd built from settlement money and donations that had poured in from across the state. The board of directors read like a roster of everyone who'd fought beside me. Elena Rodriguez, now sheriff and preparing to run for state senate on platform of property rights and constitutional protections. Dr. Amelia Washington from the Historical Society, keeper of Elijah's story and champion of preservation. Jake, now a practicing attorney specializing in civil rights law. Jennifer, my daughter, handling fundraising and community outreach with skills she'd honed in corporate marketing before redirecting them toward purpose instead of profit. And Tyler, calling in via video conference from MIT where he was halfway through his freshman year and already talking about designing better forge equipment that combined traditional techniques with modern engineering. His face on the screen looked older than 17, matured by distance and independence, but still carrying the essential kindness that made him exactly the kind of person who should have voice in governing this place. I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that represented 5 years of building something larger than personal victory. Veterans who'd found healing here, teenagers who'd discovered purpose through vocational training, families who'd learned about property rights and fought their own battles against HOA abuse, lawyers and activists and historians who'd used our story as template for defending constitutional protections. 5 years ago, I began, and my voice carried across the tent on a sound system that seemed too modern for words about history and legacy. 5 years ago, a woman named Victoria Westbrook tried to destroy this forge because it didn't fit her vision of what a neighborhood should look like. She thought she could harass me into submission, intimidate me into surrendering my family's heritage for her husband's shopping center development. Laughter rippled through the crowd, knowing laughter from people who'd followed the whole saga and knew how spectacularly that plan had failed. But this fight was never really about one building or one stubborn old veteran refusing to back down. It was about principles that matter more than property values or aesthetic standards or HOA covenants. It was about constitutional rights that protect all of us, especially those of us who don't have money or power or corporate lawyers on retainer. I paused, letting those words settle like seeds in fertile ground. Today, we're establishing foundation that will ensure this forge stands for another 200 years, not as museum to dead history, but is living space that serves each generation's needs. We're creating legal precedents that will protect other families from harassment we endured. We're building community that stands together instead of tearing each other apart. My voice cracked slightly, and I didn't try to hide it. My wife Victoria died 3 years before this fight began. During her illness, she made me promise something. Don't let them take what we built. Don't let them erase our history. Don't surrender to people who think everything is for sale. I kept that promise by fighting for this forge. But the real promise wasn't about preserving iron and stone. It was about preserving the principle that ordinary people have rights that money can't override. That history connects us to everyone who came before and everyone who'll come after. That community is stronger than intimidation when people stop being afraid. The applause started slowly, then built like thunder rolling across hills, and I had to stop speaking until it faded into silence, broken only by wind through tent canvas and the distant sound of hammering from inside the forge where another class was in session. Another generation learning ancient skills that would serve them in ways they wouldn't understand until years later, when they needed to build something permanent in their own lives. After the ceremony, after the speeches, and the signing of incorporation papers, and the photographs that would appear in newspapers and on websites, and eventually in law school textbooks about property rights, I found myself alone in the forge with Jimmy Castellano. He settled onto the bench with groan that spoke of decades catching up with bones that had marched in Selma and fought injustice for 50 years and earned every ache. "You did good, Marcus," he said simply. "This place will outlive all of us now. That's what legacy means. Building something that continues after you're gone." I sat beside him, and we drank coffee from thermoses in comfortable silence that comes from shared battles and mutual respect earned through fire. "Jimmy," I asked after a while, "do you ever regret the fights you picked, the cases you took, the enemies you made?" He considered the question with seriousness it deserved, staring at forge walls that had witnessed conversations like this for 2 centuries. "No," he said finally. "I regret the fights I didn't pick, the cases I turned away because they seemed too hard or too risky, the times I chose comfort over principle. But the fights I picked, even the ones I lost, those I'm proud of, those meant something." He turned to look at me with eyes that had seen Jim Crow and civil rights movement, and 50 years of incremental progress won through stubborn refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. "You picked the right fight, Marcus. And you won it in a way that helps people you'll never meet. That's rare. That's precious. That's exactly what Elijah was doing when he hid families in this forge. Different fight, same principle. Freedom matters, rights matter. Ordinary people standing up to powerful institutions matters." We sat until coffee was gone and afternoon was fading into evening, and it was time to lock up the forge and go home to houses that felt less empty than they used to. Because purpose-filled spaces, grief had hollowed out. 10 years later, I stood in the same doorway on a morning that felt like mirror of that September day when Tyler had told me about MIT. Except now Tyler was 27, had his engineering degree and master's in historic preservation, and was returning permanently to run the forge. Not as favor to his aging grandfather, but as his own life's work. His own calling that had pulled him back from job offers at top firms because nothing else felt as right as this place, this work, this legacy. My hair had gone completely white. My limp was more pronounced, the shrapnel in my knee protesting Tennessee winters with increasing volume. My hands shook sometimes from age or PTSD or a combination of both, making it harder to work metal with precision I'd once taken for granted. But my mind was still sharp, and my purpose was still clear, and I could still teach even if I couldn't demonstrate as easily. Tyler pulled up in a truck loaded with equipment and plans, and the kind of determined enthusiasm that reminded me of Samuel describing projects he'd built in the forge. His girlfriend Sarah, an architect who specialized in historical renovation, climbed out of the passenger seat with portfolio full of designs for expanding the workshop space while preserving original structures. "I've been thinking about that addition we discussed," Tyler said, spreading blueprints across the workbench where 4 generations of ironwood men had planned their own projects. "We can add classroom space without touching the original building. Keep everything that matters while creating room for programs to grow." Over the next months, I watched my grandson transform from student to master, from helper to leader, taking the foundation we'd built and expanding it in ways I hadn't imagined, but Elijah would have recognized. The same drive to serve community, the same willingness to adapt tradition to serve current needs, the same understanding that buildings matter less than principles they represent. The Forge became center of community that extended far beyond Grayson County. National news stories about our fight against HOA abuse had inspired similar battles across the country. Jimmy's legal precedents were being cited in courts from California to Maine. The Heritage Property Protection Scholarship had graduated 42 students who were now fighting their own battles for constitutional rights in towns and cities, where developers thought money could override law. But the real measure of impact wasn't in legal victories or preserved properties or even in lives changed through our programs. It was in the quiet moments. A veteran crying as he shaped metal and felt control return to hands that had shaken since war. A teenager discovering she was good at something that required patience and attention instead of instant digital gratification. A family learning their grandmother's house had protections they could use to fight HOA trying to force demolition. Those moments, multiplied by hundreds and then thousands as our model spread, represented something Elijah had understood when he'd risked his life for strangers. Freedom is an abstract principle or legal theory. It's concrete reality built by ordinary people doing extraordinary things because principles matter more than safety or comfort or fitting in with powerful institutions. On my 75th birthday, Jennifer organized celebration at the Forge that drew 300 people from across the state. Former students, now working as blacksmiths or artists or simply adults who remembered that old veteran who taught them something important. Veterans who credited the program with saving their lives when PTSD threatened to destroy everything. Lawyers and activists who'd used our precedents to win their own fights. Tyler presented me with a gift that made my throat close and my eyes burn with tears I didn't bother hiding anymore. A hammer. Not just any hammer. He'd forged it himself, using techniques Elijah had documented in his journal, combining traditional methods with modern metallurgy Tyler had learned at MYT. The handle was carved from oak salvaged from the forge roof when we'd done structural repairs. The head was marked with 6 simple words he'd etched carefully. For Marcus, who forges freedom still? I held that hammer, feeling its perfect balance and understanding the hours of work and love that had gone into its creation, and thought about the chain of hands that had shaped metal in this place. Elijah's hands, scarred from fire and work, and the weight of hiding people who trusted him with their lives. Samuel's hands, worn smooth by decades of honest labor and service through depression and war. My hands, marked by combat and grief and stubborn refusal to surrender what mattered. Tyler's hands, young and strong and ready to carry this forward into whatever future awaited. The chain was unbroken. The legacy continued. The forge would stand. That evening, after the celebration ended and guests departed, and Tyler and Jennifer had driven back to their respective homes, I stood alone in the forge with only moonlight through high windows, illuminating the space that smelled like coal smoke and iron, and 2 centuries of purpose. I pulled out Elijah's journal, worn now from countless readings, but preserved carefully in its wooden box that Samuel had built, and I had protected, and Tyler would inherit when I was gone. I turned to the entry I knew by heart, but needed to read one more time. March 1862. The nightmen came with dogs and torches seeking the family Elijah had hidden. We endured. What we build with our hands, we defend with our hearts. The forge is not iron and stone, it is freedom made real. I understood those words now, in ways I couldn't have understood before the fight, before the arrests, before watching this place transform from battlefield to sanctuary to living legacy that served hundreds of people every year. The forge had never been just a building. It had always been idea made physical, principle made concrete, freedom shaped by hands that refused to surrender to forces that thought power and money could override human dignity and constitutional rights. My own time was coming to an end, not tomorrow or next week, but soon enough in the grand scheme of things. My body was wearing out despite medications and physical therapy, and stubborn refusal to acknowledge limitations that were becoming harder to ignore. But the work would continue. Tyler would carry it forward. And after Tyler, someone else would pick up hammer and continue shaping metal and defending principles that mattered more than any individual life. That was what legacy meant, building something that outlasted you, creating foundation that future generations could build upon, teaching principles that would guide people you'd never meet in fights you'd never see. Elijah had done it, Samuel had done it, I had done it, and Tyler would do it for whatever came next. I closed the journal and returned it to its box, then walked outside to lock the forge doors. The night was clear, stars bright enough to read by if you had good eyes, cold enough to make my joints ache in familiar ways, that reminded me I was alive and still useful, even if not as young or strong as I used to be. The bronze plaque beside the door gleamed in moonlight. Ironwood Station, 1837, protected site of American freedom. Running my fingers across those raised letters had become ritual, reminder that this place had witnessed and sheltered and enabled freedom in all its forms across 2 centuries of American history. 3 years later, on a morning that smelled like rain and new beginnings, I woke to find I couldn't move my left side. The stroke hit like insurgent ambush, sudden and devastating and terrifying in ways combat had never quite achieved, because at least in war you could fight back. Jennifer found me 3 hours later when I didn't answer phone calls or respond to texts. The ambulance ride was blur of sirens and worried faces, and Tyler's voice telling me to hold on. "Grandpa, just hold on." The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear, and reminded me of watching Victoria die from cancer, in similar rooms with similar equipment and similar helpless feeling that life was slipping away despite everyone's best efforts. The doctor said it was moderate stroke, whatever that meant. I'd survive, they told me with practiced optimism that didn't quite hide the underlying concern. But recovery would take months. Physical therapy, speech therapy, relearning basic tasks I'd taken for granted for 78 years. "You'll need assisted living," Jennifer said gently, holding my good hand while Tyler stood at the foot of the bed, looking like he was watching his world collapse. "Dad, you can't live alone anymore. It's not safe." She was right, of course. The farmhouse where I'd lived for 30 years was no longer practical for a man who couldn't walk without walker and needed help with basic daily activities. But the thought of leaving that house, leaving proximity to the forge, leaving the life I'd built felt like dying even though my heart was still beating. Tyler had a different idea, and when he presented it 3 days later, I cried for the first time since the stroke had stolen half my movement but not my emotions. "Grandpa, we're converting the forge office into apartment for you. Wheelchair accessible, nurse on call, everything you need. You'll be right here, part of daily operations, teaching when you feel up to it, present for classes and programs and everything we've built together." He showed me architectural plans Sarah had drawn up. Bedroom, bathroom, small kitchen, sitting area with windows overlooking the main forge space. I could watch classes, receive visitors, participate in foundation meetings, continue being part of the work instead of being warehoused in facility, where I'd be just another elderly patient waiting to die. The conversion took 6 weeks. I spent that time in rehabilitation facility that smelled like industrial cleaner and despair, working with physical therapists who pushed me to relearn walking and speech and basic coordination that had always been automatic. The work was hard, harder than 2 tours in Afghanistan, or 30 years in automotive manufacturing, or 8 months fighting Victoria Westbrook. But I did it because Tyler had given me reason to keep fighting instead of surrendering to age and injury and temptation to just let go. When they wheeled me into my new apartment, the forge was full of people who'd been part of this journey. Rachel and Jimmy, both looking older but still fierce in their commitment to the work. Elena Rodriguez, now state senator but still making time to visit the place where her investigation had started career of fighting corruption. Dr. Washington, keeper of Elijah's story and champion of historical preservation. Jennifer and David and Tyler and Sarah, family that had stood beside me through everything. "Welcome home," Tyler said simply. And I realized he was right. This was home now, not the farmhouse where I'd lived with Victoria and raised Jennifer and grieved Samuel, but here, in the forge, surrounded by work that mattered, and people who understood why that work was worth continuing, even when your body failed and your time was running out. The next 2 years were a gift I hadn't expected and almost didn't deserve. I couldn't work metal anymore. Couldn't demonstrate techniques or shape iron with hands that shook too much for precision. But I could teach. I could tell stories. I could sit in my wheelchair in the corner of the forge and watch classes and offer guidance and share hard-won wisdom about craftsmanship and principle and stubborn refusal to surrender what matters. Veterans came to visit, drawn by word that the old man who'd fought HOA and won was still here, still teaching, still available for conversations about PTSD and healing and finding purpose after trauma. Teenagers asked questions about history and justice and what it meant to stand up to bullies. Lawyers and activists sought advice about property rights cases they were fighting in other communities. I became living connection to the fight, to the principles it represented, to the legacy that was now bigger than any individual. People wanted to meet the man who'd stood up to Victoria Westbrook, who'd refused to surrender his grandfather's forge, who'd built foundation that was now serving thousands of people across Tennessee and inspiring similar efforts in other states. But more than that, they wanted to touch history directly, to hear firsthand from someone who'd fought for constitutional rights and won, to understand that ordinary people could still make difference if they had courage to stand up and fight when principles were at stake. Tyler documented everything with video camera, creating oral history archive that would preserve these conversations for future generations. My stories about the fight, my reflections on what it meant, my advice for others facing similar battles, my hopes for future where constitutional rights would be protected and communities would stand together instead of tearing each other apart. On good days, I could speak clearly and share wisdom earned through hard experience. On bad days, my words slurred and my thoughts tangled, and I had to rest while frustration ate at me because there was still so much to say, and time was running shorter with each passing week. Jennifer visited daily, bringing Tyler's children, my great-grandchildren, who would never know me except through stories and videos. 6-year-old Emma held my shaking hand and asked why I was in wheelchair, and I told her truth. Sometimes our bodies wear out before our purposes do, but that's okay, because we pass the work to people who come after us. She absorbed that with seriousness that reminded me of Tyler at her age, then asked if she could learn blacksmithing when she was bigger. Tyler promised her she could, and I saw the chain extending forward another generation, unbroken by my impending death, or the passage of time that waited for no one. On an October morning that matched the temperature when I'd first stood in this forge 5 years after Samuel's death and decided to fight instead of surrender, I woke feeling different, lighter somehow, as if weight I'd carried for 79 years was finally lifting. The hospice nurse Rachel had hired recognized the signs and called Jennifer and Tyler immediately. They arrived within 20 minutes, gathering around my bed in an apartment that had become my world. Through the window, I could see forge space where morning class was in session, teenagers learning the satisfaction of shaping metal and building something permanent. The sound of hammer on anvil drifted through walls, rhythmic and eternal, proof that work would continue after I was gone. "Dad," Jennifer said, holding my good hand while tears streamed down her face, "I love you. Thank you for teaching me that some things are worth fighting for." Tyler leaned close, his voice breaking. "Grandpa, you built something that will last forever. Elijah would be proud. Samuel would be proud. I'm proud." I tried to speak, to tell them I was proud too, proud of who they'd become and what they'd accomplished, and the legacy they would carry forward. But words wouldn't come anymore, trapped behind stroke damage that had taken speech along with movement. So I squeezed Jennifer's hand and met Tyler's eyes, and hoped they could read in my face what I couldn't say aloud. "I love you. Thank you. Continue the work. Defend what matters. Build freedom with your hands and hearts. The forge is not iron and stone. It is principle made real. Don't let it die with me." As my vision faded and breathing became harder, and the distant sound of hammering merged with my slowing heartbeat, my last thought was gratitude. Gratitude that I'd fought when fighting mattered. Gratitude that I'd built something that would outlast me. Gratitude that I'd kept promises to Samuel and Victoria and Elijah and all the ironwood men who'd shaped metal and defended freedom in this place for nearly 2 centuries. The hammer would fall again tomorrow. The forge would stand. The work would continue. And that was enough. That was everything. That was what legacy meant. Marcus Ironwood died peacefully on October 15th, surrounded by family, with the sound of his life's work continuing in the background. He was 79 years old. The forge he'd fought to save now served over 2,000 people annually through vocational training, veterans programs, historical preservation, and legal advocacy that protected property rights across Tennessee and beyond. His fight against HOA abuse had established precedents cited in over 300 court cases and inspired protective legislation in 14 states. But his real legacy wasn't measured in legal victories or preserved properties or lives changed through programs he'd established. His real legacy was principle made concrete, the idea that ordinary Americans have rights that money and power can't override, that history connects us to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. That community is stronger than intimidation when people stop being afraid and start standing together. The Ironwood Heritage Foundation continues his work under Tyler's leadership. The forge stands as it has stood for 198 years, protected by federal law and sustained by community, and defended by people who understand that some things transcend property values and aesthetic standards, and HOA covenants written by lawyers who never built anything permanent with their own hands. What Marcus built with his hands, we defend with our hearts. The forge is not iron and stone, it is freedom made real. And it will stand for another 200 years, serving whatever freedom means to each generation that inherits the responsibility and privilege of continuing work that began with escaped slaves seeking sanctuary and continues with every person who learns that their hands can create permanence in temporary world. That is the Ironwood legacy. That is what happens when one stubborn veteran refuses to surrender to people who think everything is for sale. That is why some fights, some principles, some pieces of history are worth everything you have to give. Because what we defend together becomes who we are. And who we are becomes what we pass forward to those who come after, hoping they'll have courage to fight their own battles and build their own legacies, and keep the hammer falling long after we're gone. The forge stands, the work continues, the legacy lives. And that, in the end, is all that really matters.